parchment is not very large, not grand enough at first glance to change the shape of the world. It is a surviving fragment, torn from a larger whole, its edges uneven, its surface crowded with names, coastlines, islands, compass lines, and inked shapes that seem to lean out of the past with uncomfortable confidence. A modern viewer expects an old map to look uncertain. It should stumble. It should leave blank spaces where oceans widen, distort continents into strange beasts, and fill the margins with warnings, monsters, or sacred geography. Yet some ancient and early maps do something more unsettling. They appear to know too much. They seem to preserve coastlines before the official age of discovery, hint at lands not yet reached by the people who drew them, or arrange seas with a precision that feels out of place beside the instruments of their time. This is where the mystery begins, not in a lost temple or a buried city, but on thin sheets of animal skin and paper, in the quiet survival of lines. A coastline bends where it should be unknown. An island appears where no voyage is supposed to have gone. A southern land stretches across the edge of a world that Europe has not yet named. A medieval sea chart places ports with startling accuracy, even though its makers had no satellites, no chronometers, and no modern longitude. The ink is old, but the questions feel strangely alive. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The phrase ancient maps that should not exist carries a dangerous pull. It suggests forbidden knowledge, vanished civilizations, secret voyages, and perhaps the dream that history is hiding something enormous in plain sight. Popular writers have sometimes used these maps as evidence for lost supercivilizations, ancient global empires, or travellers who crossed oceans thousands of years before accepted history allows. Some claims go even farther, drifting into unsupported ideas about visitors from beyond the Earth or impossible technologies erased by time. Those stories are dramatic, but drama is not the same as evidence. The real mystery is quieter, and in many ways more interesting. These maps do not prove that the ancient world had satellites, or that a forgotten empire mapped the whole planet with modern instruments. What they reveal is the difficult, fragile, and often underestimated power of human observation. A map is never just a drawing of land. It is a memory system. It records fear, trade, ambition, war, survival, and the need to return home. A coastline on a map may be the residue of a fishing route followed for generations. A river bend may preserve the knowledge of merchants who crossed deserts and caravans. A chain of islands may carry the experience of sailors who watched birds at dawn and waves at sunset. Even when a map is wrong, it is wrong in revealing ways. Its distortions show what mattered to the people who made it, what they had heard, what they misunderstood, what they copied, and what they hoped was true. The most unsettling maps often survive far from their original makers. They come down through copies, translations, damaged manuscripts, court archives, religious libraries, imperial offices, and private collections. By the time modern scholars examine them, their origins may already be layered beneath centuries of handling. A 16th century map may contain information from a 15th century portolan chart, which may have drawn on 14th century pilot books, which may have preserved older sailing traditions from Arab, Greek, Venetian, Genoese, Portuguese, or unknown hands. The map itself is a visible object, but the chain behind it may be mostly invisible. That is where certainty begins to thin. One of the most famous examples is the map associated with the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, drawn in 1513 and surviving today as only part of a larger world map. It shows portions of the Atlantic, Western Africa, Eastern South America, and islands of the Caribbean. Its survival alone is remarkable. Its reputation is even more so. Some readers have claimed that it shows Antarctica before Antarctica was known, even before the continent was covered in ice. That claim is not accepted by mainstream scholarship, and the evidence remains incomplete. The southern land on the map is more plausibly a distorted continuation of South America, or a product of inherited geographic ideas. Yet the map still matters deeply, because Piri Reis himself says he compiled it from multiple sources, including Portuguese charts and older maps. Whether every detail is correct is less important than the glimpse it gives of a world where geographic knowledge moved across cultures, languages, rival empires, and dangerous seas. In that world, information is treasure. A good chart can guide a ship to spice, gold, slaves, fish, timber, safe harbours, or military advantage. A bad chart can kill everyone aboard. Maps are copied in secret, stolen in war, traded among pilots, hidden in royal archives, and sometimes deliberately altered. When a coastline appears unexpectedly early, it may not mean the official story of exploration is entirely wrong. It may mean the official story has preserved only the names of kings, captains, and empires, while losing the anonymous pilots, merchants, prisoners, fishermen, interpreters, and local guides whose knowledge made discovery possible. The idea that a map should not exist often comes from a modern misunderstanding of how knowledge accumulates. Modern people are trained to think in clean dates. A continent is discovered in 1 year, a route is opened by one expedition, a map is made by one named cartographer, but the real past is messier. Coastlines enter memory in pieces. One sailor learns a bay, another learns a current, a merchant hears of a river mouth, a captured pilot describes an island, a monastery preserves an old text, a court geographer copies a fragment without fully understanding it. Over time, pieces gather, They do not always gather neatly. They can produce maps that are brilliant in one region and wildly wrong in another, precise along a trade route and almost mythical beyond it. That mixture is what makes these documents so haunting. They are not perfect windows into a lost age. They are broken windows, cracked, stained, and still letting through light. A Portolan chart of the Mediterranean may place harbours with impressive practical accuracy while leaving inland geography vague. A world map may combine careful coastal knowledge with biblical tradition, classical theory, sailor rumour, and decorative imagination. A copied island may drift across the ocean over generations because one scribe misread another's lettering. A peninsula may become an island. A continent may stretch too far south because old ideas of balance insisted that the world needed land below the equator to match the land above it. Scholars still debate how some medieval chart makers achieved their accuracy, especially in the sea maps known as Portolans. These charts emerged around the late 13th century and show the Mediterranean and Black Sea with a practical sharpness that seems sudden. They are crossed by networks of rum lines radiating from compass roses, designed for navigation from port to port. Their coastlines are not modern in the strict sense, but they are good enough to make older symbolic maps look almost dreamlike by comparison. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature. Mariners' compass use accumulated sailing directions, practical measurement, repeated copying, and the dense traffic of the Mediterranean all likely contributed. The mystery is not that impossible technology was hiding behind them. The mystery is that ordinary seafaring experience and preserved and refined over generations could produce something so effective before the mathematical tools of later cartography fully arrived. There is also a psychological reason these maps grip the imagination. They sit at the border between what is known and what is wished for. People want the past to be larger than the surviving record. In many cases, it almost certainly was. The ancient world knew more than what remains in museums. Most maps were destroyed by damp, fire, insects, war, neglect, and simple use. Sea charts wore out. Pilot notes were practical objects, not sacred relics. They were folded, stained, corrected, copied. And discarded, a map that survives may be the rare accident, while thousands of related documents vanished without leaving even ash. What survives in the record suggests not a single hidden master map of the Earth, but countless acts of observation now mostly lost. That loss can feel like an invitation to fantasy, but it is also a warning. When evidence disappears, imagination rushes in, it fills gaps with ancient astronauts, vanished Atlanteans, secret priesthoods, or world-spanning prehistoric empires. Some of these stories are entertaining, but they often flatten the achievements of real people. They replace sailors, mathematicians, traders, astronomers, scribes, and coastal communities with a single impossible explanation. The truth is less tidy and more human. People watched the world with patience. They followed stars until the sky became a road. They memorized currents by the pull of a hull. They learned that certain birds meant land, that certain clouds formed over islands, that the colour of water could change above hidden reefs. They measured shadows, argued over distances, copied old names, corrected errors, and sometimes made new ones. The ancient maps that seem out of place are therefore not merely puzzles about geography. They are relics of transmission. They show how knowledge survives by passing through hands that may not fully understand it, how a line drawn for one purpose can later become evidence in a debate its maker never imagined. They remind the modern world that discovery is rarely a single heroic moment. It is more often a long accumulation of partial truths, some preserved, some distorted, and many lost forever. The first step into this story is to set aside the easy claim that these maps are impossible. They exist, so the real question is harder. What made them possible? The answer leads backward into harbours filled with salt-stiff ropes, into libraries where old geographic texts are copied by candlelight, into imperial courts hungry for roots and revenue, into the minds of navigators who carry entire coastlines without writing them down. It leads toward the strange world before modern cartography, when maps were not yet mirrors of the Earth, but instruments of memory, power, belief, and survival. Long before maps begin to resemble the familiar shapes of continents on a classroom wall, people are already mapping the world in ways that serve their lives. They do not always need parchment, ink, or measured coordinates. A hunter knows the slope where deer pass before dawn. A fisher knows the reef by the pattern of breaking water above it. A caravan leader knows which stars rise over the desert when the wells are still days away. A village elder remembers the bend in the river where floods once took the fields. These are maps without borders, maps carried in bodies and stories, maps made of route, rhythm, danger, and return. To understand why certain old maps seem impossible, it is necessary to enter this older world of geography, where accuracy does not always mean mathematical precision. Modern cartography values scale, projection, longitude, latitude, and the careful translation of a round Earth onto a flat surface. Ancient and medieval mapmakers often worked with different priorities. Some maps show roads better than distances, some show sacred centres better than coastlines. Some enlarge cities because they matter politically or spiritually, not because they occupy more physical space. Some compress oceans because the map is meant to explain the order of the world rather than guide a sailor across it. A map can be wrong as a measurement and still deeply accurate as a record of how people understand space. The earliest known maps are not world maps in the modern sense. They are local, practical, symbolic, and sometimes difficult to classify. Ancient people mark fields, canals, mountains, settlements, and routes, Mesopotamian tablets record land divisions, irrigation systems, and city plans. Egyptian artists draw routes through desert mining regions and tomb landscapes with a mixture of practical direction and sacred meaning. In the Roman world, route maps and itineraries help travellers imagine empire not as a measured surface, but as a chain of roads, stations, and cities. A person moving through that world does not necessarily need an exact coastline. He needs to know how many days to the next harbour, where fresh water can be found, which mountain pass is blocked by snow, and which ruler controls the gate. This difference matters because later observers sometimes judge old maps by the wrong standard. A medieval world map that places Jerusalem at the centre of the earth is not simply a failed geography lesson. It is a theological and historical diagram, arranging the world according to meaning as much as distance. A Roman road itinerary that stretches and bends the landscape may be useless for measuring the width of Italy, but excellent for understanding how travellers move between towns. A sailor's chart, by contrast, may care little for theology or empire and everything for the angle from one port to another. Each map is shaped by need. The people who made and used maps also lived in a world where memory has a status. Modern life often underestimates. Writing helps preserve knowledge, but it can also weaken the ability to carry it internally. In societies where survival depends on remembering landscapes, memory becomes disciplined, trained, and social. Routes are sung, genealogies are attached to places, landmarks are embedded in stories, the movement of animals, stars, winds, and seasonal water is organised into traditions that can last for generations. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because oral knowledge leaves fewer traces than inscriptions or manuscripts. But what survives in the record suggests that ancient navigation and wayfinding were often far richer than modern assumptions allow. Among seafaring peoples, the sea itself becomes a text. The Mediterranean, with its enclosed waters and busy coastlines, produces one kind of knowledge. The Indian Ocean, ruled by monsoon winds, produces another. The Pacific, vast and island scattered, produces still another. Polynesian navigators, for example, are known for extraordinary non-instrument navigation across immense distances, using stars, swells, birds, cloud forms, and subtle signs in the water. This does not mean they drew global maps in the European sense. It means that maps can exist as structured memory, as a living system of directional knowledge. When later Europeans encounter navigators who can cross open ocean without charts, the achievement seems almost uncanny. It is not magic. It is observation sharpened by necessity. On land, the same principle holds. Desert travellers read dunes, stars, wind, and the distribution of scarce vegetation. Mountain communities know passes, avalanche paths, grazing grounds, and hidden springs. River civilizations measure the world by flood cycles and canal networks. In ancient Egypt, the annual Nile flood reshapes fields, property boundaries, and agricultural life, making measurement not a luxury, but a requirement. Geometry develops in part from practical needs like restoring boundaries after inundation, though scholars still debate how directly such needs shaped later mathematical traditions. The crucial point is that geography begins not as abstract knowledge, but as a response to risk. The ancient Greeks pushed this knowledge into a more theoretical form. They inherit stories from sailors, traders, soldiers, and earlier civilizations, then begin asking how the Earth itself is shaped. By the classical period, Greek thinkers debate the size of the Earth, the arrangement of inhabited lands, and the relationship between observation and mathematical reasoning. Eratosthenes, working in the 3rd century BCE, famously estimates the circumference of the Earth with impressive intelligence, using the angle of the sun at different locations and the distance between them. His result is not a modern survey, and the exact values depend on disputed measurements, but the method reveals something profound. Ancient geography is not only rumour and myth, it can be calculation. This mathematical impulse does not erase error. In fact, it sometimes gives error a longer life. Once a respected authority records a distance, coastline, or regional shape, later copyists may preserve it for centuries. Claudius Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, creates a geographic system using coordinates for thousands of places. His work is astonishing in ambition, but it also contains serious distortions, including an overextended Eurasia and a too small estimate of the Earth's circumference in some later interpretations. When Ptolemy's geography is rediscovered and copied in medieval and Renaissance Europe, it becomes both a treasure and a trap. It offers a framework for mapping the world, while carrying errors forward with the authority of antiquity. Here the strange nature of old maps becomes clearer. They are not made from pure ignorance slowly improving into pure accuracy. They are mixtures. A map may contain careful observation near home, inherited theory from ancient texts, traveller reports from distant lands, political imagination, religious symbolism, and deliberate decoration. It may preserve a correct harbour beside a mythical island. It may copy an old coordinate while adding a newly discovered coastline. It may be updated unevenly, like a house repaired room by room over centuries while its foundation remains ancient. The making of a map is also limited by tools. Latitude can be estimated with the sun and stars, though not always easily or accurately at sea. Longitude is far more difficult without reliable timekeeping. Before marine chronometers, determining east-west position across open ocean remains a major challenge. Mariners can estimate by dead reckoning, using speed, direction, and time, but errors accumulate, winds push ships, currents move them unseen, Clouds hide stars, storms break routines. A skilled pilot may still bring a vessel safely across a known route, but converting that experience into a map with modern precision is another matter entirely. Because of this, coastlines on old maps often behave strangely. They may be locally accurate where sailors have moved repeatedly and wildly distorted, where information comes from rumour or theory. They may rotate, stretch, or compress, because the mapmaker is trying to reconcile conflicting sources. Islands multiply because sightings are mislocated, duplicated, or copied from earlier charts without verification. Some phantom islands remain on maps for centuries. Not because everyone who copied them is foolish, but because removing inherited information can feel riskier than preserving it. A sailor would rather be warned of an island that is not there than strike one omitted by confidence. There is a lesser known but important detail in this world: many practical maps were never meant to survive. A royal presentation map might be preserved because it is beautiful or politically valuable. A sacred map might be copied because it belongs to a religious tradition, but a working sea chart is exposed to salt air, wet hands, crowded decks, and constant correction. It is used until it wears out. The survival record is therefore biased towards certain kinds of maps. The maps that endure may not be the most common or the most practically important. They are the ones protected by accident, wealth, prestige, or archival habit. This bias can make cartographic history seem more sudden than it really was. When portolan charts appear in surviving records with impressive sophistication, it may look as though they emerge from nowhere. In reality, they likely stand at the visible end of an invisible chain of practice: pilot books, oral sailing directions, coastal sketches, compass experience, and repeated voyages may have prepared the ground long before the surviving examples were made. The absence of earlier documents does not prove absence of earlier knowledge. It only marks the edge of what has survived. Yet caution is essential. Gaps in the record do not permit any explanation one might desire. They do not automatically prove lost global civilizations or impossible voyages. They simply remind us that the past is incomplete. Responsible mystery begins in that tension between humility and imagination. Ancient and medieval people were capable of astonishing observation, but they were also capable of error, exaggeration, copying mistakes, and symbolic thinking. Their maps can be brilliant, confused, practical, sacred, political, and beautiful all at once. The world before modern cartography is therefore not a dark age waiting for accuracy to arrive. It is a different landscape of knowledge, where a map may be a legal document, a prayer, a memory palace, a merchant's tool, an imperial boast, a sailor's guide, or a scholar's model of the earth. Once that is understood, the maps that seem to know too much become less like impossible artifacts and more like clues. They suggest hidden networks of travel, lost archives of observation, and generations of people who measured the world not from above, but by moving through it, step by step, coast by coast, star by star. The surviving fragment of the Piri Reis map waits like a puzzle with half its pieces burned away. It was drawn in 1513 by Ahmed Muhiddin Piri, better known as Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, sailor, and cartographer whose life belongs to the violent hinge between the medieval and early modern worlds. He is not a dreamer sketching imaginary islands in a quiet monastery. He is a man of ships, ports, battles, intelligence, empire, and practical sea knowledge. His world is one of contested waters, where the Mediterranean and Atlantic are no longer separate mental spaces, where Portuguese voyages around Africa, Spanish voyages across the Atlantic, Ottoman naval ambition, Arab pilot traditions, and older Mediterranean chart-making all collide. The map itself survives only as a fragment, discovered in the 20th century in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. That detail alone gives it an almost theatrical entrance into modern history. A royal archive preserves a torn piece of parchment for centuries, not because anyone knows it will one day become famous, but because it belongs to the paper memory of empire. When modern scholars begin to examine it, they find not a complete world map, but a section showing parts of the Atlantic world. The western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, islands in the Atlantic, and portions of the Caribbean. The fragment is crowded with inscriptions and decorative elements, but beneath the artistic surface lies something more important. Piri Reis tells the viewer that his map is compiled from earlier charts, including Portuguese sources and a map associated with Columbus. That claim immediately pulls the map into the dangerous zone between history and legend. Columbus reaches the Caribbean in 1492, only 21 years before Piri Reis draws his map. Europeans are still struggling to understand what these western lands are. The Americas are not yet fully imagined as separate continents by everyone. South America's coastline is being explored in pieces. The Caribbean is being charted through conquest, rumour, violence, and hurried imperial competition. Yet on this Ottoman map, a version of the Atlantic world appears, assembled far from the Spanish court and Portuguese archives. It is not perfect, but it is striking. It shows how quickly geographic intelligence travels when power depends on it. The most famous claim surrounding the Piri Reis map is that it depicts Antarctica centuries before the continent is officially sighted, and not merely Antarctica, but Antarctica as it would appear without its ice. This idea becomes popular in the 20th century, especially among writers searching for evidence of advanced ancient civilizations. The argument usually focuses on the southern extension of land at the bottom of the map. To some eyes, this shape resembles part of the Antarctic coast. If true, it would be extraordinary beyond measure. because Antarctica is not reached by confirmed modern explorers until the 19th century, and its ice-covered coastline requires advanced surveying to map properly, but mainstream scholarship does not accept this interpretation. The evidence remains incomplete, and the more cautious explanation is that the supposed Antarctic coastline is a distorted continuation of South America, shaped by copying, projection problems, geographic expectation, and inherited ideas about southern lands. This does not make the map uninteresting. In fact, it makes it more revealing. The temptation is to focus only on the most impossible claim, then either accept it as proof of a lost civilization or reject it and dismiss the entire object. Both responses miss the deeper story. The Piri Reis map is fascinating not because it proves ancient people mapped Antarctica. It is fascinating because it shows a world in which geographic knowledge is being gathered, stolen, copied, translated, and reassembled at remarkable speed. It is a map of information movement as much as land. Piri Reis is unusually helpful because he comments on his sources. He says he uses around 20 maps and charts, including older maps from the time of Alexander, Arab maps of India, Portuguese charts, and a chart said to come from Columbus. Some of this must be treated carefully. References to ancient authorities can sometimes serve prestige as much as documentation. A mapmaker may invoke venerable sources to increase credibility, and the precise identity of each source is hard to recover. Still, the statement fits the wider world of early 16th century cartography. No single mapmaker stands alone. Every chart is a conversation with earlier charts. Every coastline is a negotiation between observation and inheritance. The Ottoman Empire is well placed to gather such knowledge. Istanbul is not a remote observer of European expansion. It sits at the crossing of worlds. The empire has access to Mediterranean pilots, Arab geographic traditions, captured sailors, merchants, diplomats, spies, and naval records. The Portuguese and Spanish are trying to control ocean routes, but secrecy is never perfect. Ships are taken, pilots defect or are forced to speak, charts are copied. Information leaks through ports like water through rope. In a century when a good map can redirect wealth across oceans, geographic knowledge is both weapon and treasure. The Caribbean portion of the Piri Reis map shows the difficulties of early transatlantic cartography. Some islands are misplaced, some forms are confused. The map reflects a period when Europeans and others are still trying to fit new lands into older frameworks. It's easy to forget how bewildering the Americas are at first to mapmakers trained in classical geography. Are these islands off Asia? Are they part of a new continent? How wide is the ocean? How far does South America extend? The answers are not available all at once. They arrive through voyages, reports, errors, rival claims, and partial coastal surveys. A map made in 1513 is not a final statement. It is a snapshot of confusion becoming knowledge. One lesser-known feature of the Piri Reis map is how it combines practical and decorative traditions. It is visually rich, with ships, animals, figures, notes, and vivid colours. To a modern eye, decoration can make a map seem less scientific, but in its own world, beauty and information are not opposites. A courtly or imperial map is expected to impress. It communicates possession, learning, and reach. It tells rulers that the maker has gathered knowledge from afar and arranged it into a form worthy of attention, yet the decorative surface does not erase the working knowledge underneath. The map belongs to a period when art, politics, navigation, and intelligence overlap. The South American coastline on the map remains one of its strongest points of interest. Parts of it correspond in broad terms to regions that Portuguese sailors had explored by the early 16th century. This should not be surprising, but it is still historically powerful. It suggests that information from Portuguese Atlantic exploration has reached Ottoman hands quickly enough to be incorporated into a major cartographic work. The coastline is not a modern survey. Distances and shapes are distorted. Still, it preserves a trace of early contact between separate imperial knowledge systems. In this sense, the map should not be treated as an isolated anomaly. It is evidence of a connected world. The supposed impossibility of the map often depends on underestimating that connectedness. Popular mystery prefers the image of one lone genius or one hidden ancient source. The real picture is more crowded. There are pilots who never sign maps, captains who bring back rough coastal sketches, enslaved and captured people who carry geographic information unwillingly, merchants who repeat routes in conversation, interpreters who reshape names, scribes who copy foreign words into familiar scripts, and officials who decide what should be preserved. Piri Reis stands at the visible centre of a network, but the network itself is much larger than him. Scholars still debate details of the map's sources, its distortions, and the exact meaning of some inscriptions. No single explanation fully accounts for every line. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the normal condition of studying a damaged composite artifact more than 5 centuries old. What can be said with confidence is that the Piri Reis map does not need impossible technology to be remarkable. Its power lies in the way it captures geography during a moment of violent expansion. When the known world is breaking open and old maps are being forced to absorb new coastlines faster than theory can explain them, the map also reveals how easily modern imagination can overwhelm historical evidence. A torn southern coastline becomes Antarctica. A reference to ancient sources becomes proof of a lost prehistoric archive. A distorted shape becomes a secret too large for historians to admit. But careful reading shows something subtler and more durable. The map is not a clean miracle. It is a palimpsest of voyages, rumours, imperial hunger, older learning, and practical seamanship. It belongs to the age when the ocean stops being a boundary at the edge of the map and becomes the centre of global power. In the end, the Piri Reis map unsettles not because it shows a world no one could have known, but because it shows how knowledge survives in fragments, moving through channels that the official story rarely preserves. Its torn edges remind us that what remains is only part of what once existed. The missing portions may have shown other coastlines, other mistakes, other borrowed knowledge, other ambitions. The fragment does not answer every question, it sharpens them. And once the eye adjusts to the crowded ink of that parchment, another mystery begins to appear behind it, the vanished source maps that fed it, the older charts Piri Reis used, and the long-lost hands that drew coastlines before their own names disappeared. Behind every old map that survives, there may be many maps that do not. This is one of the quiet truths of cartographic history, and it changes the way the mystery must be approached. A surviving parchment can feel like a single witness standing before the modern world, but it's often only the last voice in a long chain of copying. Its lines may have passed through workshops, ship cabins, court offices, monastic libraries, trading houses, and naval archives before reaching the form now preserved in a museum. By the time a map is found, the sources behind it may already be gone, leaving only traces embedded in coastlines, place names, mistakes, and strange acts of repetition. This is why Piri Reis matters beyond his own map. He openly says that he compiled his work from earlier charts. He does not present himself as a man who personally surveyed every coast he draws. He is an assembler of knowledge, and in this he is not unusual. Many early mapmakers are compilers. They gather reports, older maps, sailing directions, traveller accounts, astronomical measurements, political claims, and inherited geographic theories. Their skill lies not only in drawing, but in deciding what to trust, what to ignore, and how to combine conflicting information on one surface. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they preserve an error so persuasively that later generations mistake it for discovery. The missing source maps are difficult to imagine because they are mostly absent from the record. A chart used by a pilot on a trading voyage may never enter a royal library. A coastal sketch made after a dangerous passage may be copied once, then destroyed by damp. A ship captured in war may surrender its charts, which are then translated, altered, and absorbed into another empire's archives. A mapmaker may copy from a copy of a copy, never knowing which parts are first-hand observation and which parts are already centuries old. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that geographic knowledge often travels in fragments rather than complete systems. This fragmentary movement explains why old maps can look uneven in such revealing ways. One coast may be detailed because it came from repeated voyages. Another may be vague because it came from rumour. A bay may be placed with confidence beside an island that never existed. A river mouth may be correct while the inland course of the same river becomes fantasy. These contradictions do not necessarily mean the mapmaker is careless. They may mean he is working with sources of different quality, different age and different purpose. A practical sea chart, a scholar's world map, and a merchant's route description do not speak the same language, yet a compiler may try to make them agree. In the ancient and medieval world, copying is not a mechanical act, it is interpretation. A scribe or mapmaker must read names in unfamiliar languages, judge damaged lines, translate distances, and fit old information into a new visual framework. Coastlines can shift simply because the copyist changes scale. Place names can migrate when written labels are crowded or misunderstood. Islands can duplicate when two sources describe the same land under different names. A cape can become an island if the connecting line is faint or omitted. Over generations, these small acts can produce large mysteries. What later appears to be a deliberate representation of an unknown continent may begin as a copied distortion of a more familiar shore. This process is especially important when dealing with classical sources. Greek and Roman geography never vanishes completely, but it survives unevenly. Some texts are copied in Byzantium, preserved in Arabic translation, studied by Islamic scholars, recovered in Latin Europe, and then reinterpreted during the Renaissance. Each stage can carry both preservation and alteration. Ptolemy's geography is one of the great examples. It offers coordinates, methods, and a vision of mapping based on mathematical order, yet its own errors are repeatedly inherited. When Renaissance mapmakers use Ptolemy, they are not simply restoring ancient truth. They are reviving a powerful system that must be reconciled with new voyages and new evidence. Lost source maps also raise a deeper problem, the difference between knowledge and survival. A civilization may know something and still fail to preserve it in a way later historians can prove. Mariners may sail routes for generations without producing durable charts. Local communities may know coastlines, reefs, seasonal winds, and island chains with great precision while leaving no parchment record. A ruler may possess maps that are later burned, looted, or discarded. The absence of a surviving document does not mean the knowledge never existed, but neither does it allow unlimited speculation. Scholars still debate how much pre-modern geographic knowledge disappeared, and how much can be safely inferred from later copies. The history of libraries and archives is full of quiet catastrophes. Fires destroy collections, war scatters manuscripts, humidity rots paper, insects eat bindings. Political change makes old administrative records worthless. Religious and cultural shifts decide which texts deserve copying and which may be neglected. Practical documents are especially vulnerable. A beautiful illuminated manuscript may be protected because it is expensive and symbolic. A working chart may be used until it is stained, torn, outdated, and thrown away. In this way, the survival of maps is not a neutral sample of the past. It is an accident shaped by wealth, prestige, climate, violence, and taste. A lesser known but crucial detail is that maps can preserve obsolete knowledge long after better information exists. This sounds backward, but it is common. A map maker may copy an old, prestigious source because it carries authority. A ruler may prefer a traditional image of the world because it reinforces political or religious meaning. A printed map may continue circulating after new discoveries have made parts of it wrong. Once a shape enters the cartographic tradition, it can become stubborn. Phantom islands survive because they are copied from respected charts. Inland seas appear and reappear because earlier writers imagined them. Southern continents stretch across empty spaces because philosophers and geographers believed the Earth required balance. The idea of a great southern land is especially revealing. Long before Antarctica is known through direct exploration, many map makers imagine a terra australis, a southern continent balancing the land masses of the north. This is not evidence that they had seen Antarctica. It is evidence of theory shaping geography. To modern eyes, a southern land on an old map may look prophetic. In its own context, it may be speculative. Inherited from classical reasoning and repeated because it made the world feel orderly. The danger is that later viewers may mistake an imagined land for a surveyed one, especially when its position roughly coincides with a real continent discovered much later. Yet some inherited features are not merely imaginary. They may preserve real reports that have become distorted beyond easy recognition. A sailor's encounter with an island, a merchant's description of a coast, or a military expedition's route may enter a map through an indirect path. By the time it appears, its scale and position may be wrong, but its origin may still be rooted in experience. This is one reason old maps resist simple judgment. They are neither pure fantasy nor reliable survey. They are layered documents where observation, speculation, copying, and authority share the same ink. The vanished source maps behind famous artifacts therefore become a kind of shadow archive. They cannot be fully reconstructed, but their presence can be felt. When Piri Reis refers to Portuguese charts, the statement points toward the secretive cartographic world of Iberian expansion. When medieval charts show repeated patterns across different manuscripts, they suggest common ancestors now lost. When Renaissance maps suddenly combine classical forms with fresh coastlines, they reveal the collision of old texts and new voyages. In each case, the surviving map is not an origin, it is a descendant. This matters because the popular phrase should not exist often assumes that the map appears alone, out of nowhere, with no possible path for its knowledge. But maps rarely appear from nowhere. They grow from older maps, from practical roots, from official records, from oral reports, from stolen documents, and from the patient correction of error. The real question is not whether a single impossible source existed, but how many ordinary sources vanished before one extraordinary-looking map survived. No single explanation fully accounts for every mysterious line on every old chart, but the pattern is clear enough. The past leaves fragments, and fragments can look impossible when the chain between them is broken. There is something almost melancholy in this. The map that survives becomes famous, while the maps that made it possible are nameless. The pilot who corrected a cape, the clerk who copied a harbour name, the captured sailor who described an island, the monk who preserved a classical coordinate, the merchant who repeated a coastal distance across a table in a foreign port, all vanish behind the polished surface of a known artefact. Their knowledge is not heroic in the grand style, it is cumulative. Practical and fragile, but without it the famous maps could not exist. So the mystery deepens by becoming more human. The impossible map is not a message from a vanished super-civilization. It is more often the visible tip of a submerged history of observation. It tells us that knowledge can survive its makers, but not always its context. A coastline may remain after the voyage that produced it is forgotten. A name may remain after the language that shaped it is misunderstood. A southern land may remain after theory and rumour have fused so tightly that later readers struggle to separate them. These remnants do not close the case. They open it carefully, leading from famous fragments toward one of the strangest achievements of medieval seafaring, the Portolan charts, those practical sea maps whose precision still seems to rise too suddenly from the waters of the Mediterranean. The Portolan charts appear like instruments from a world that has suddenly decided to become practical. After centuries of maps that often place sacred history, imperial memory, and classical geography above measured coastline, these sea charts arrive with a startlingly different attitude. They do not seem deeply interested in the theological centre of the world. They do not pause to arrange continents into symbolic harmony. They are busy, dense, and purposeful. Their surfaces are crossed by radiating lines. Their coasts are crowded with port names, and their attention clings closely to the edge where land meets water. For a sailor, that edge is everything. It is danger, refuge, trade, tax, storm shelter, fresh water, and the difference between arrival and disappearance. The earliest surviving Portolan charts emerge around the late 13th century, especially in the Mediterranean world. Their sudden appearance has long made them feel mysterious. They show the Mediterranean and Black Sea with a degree of practical accuracy that seems far ahead of many earlier surviving maps. The coastlines are not perfect by modern standards, and distortions remain, but compared with symbolic world maps of the same broad period, they feel almost like a different species. Harbours, headlands, islands, and coastal sequences are arranged in ways that reflect repeated maritime experience. The map is no longer primarily a picture of cosmic order, it is a working memory of movement. The name itself comes from Portolano, meaning a sailing guide or harbour book, though the relationship between written Portolans and drawn Portolan charts remains complex. Mariners in the Mediterranean had long used practical sailing directions, listing routes from one port to another, noting distances, winds, hazards, and coastal landmarks. Such instructions could be memorised, recited, written, corrected, and passed among pilots. The chart transforms this accumulated knowledge into a visual web. Instead of reading a route as a sequence of instructions, a navigator can see relationships between coasts, islands, and bearings. The result is not a modern map in every sense, but it is a powerful tool. One of the most recognisable features of Portolan charts is the network of rhumb lines spreading from compass roses or central points across the map. These lines are not latitude and longitude in the modern gridded sense. They represent directions, useful for plotting courses by compass bearing. The magnetic compass, entering Mediterranean navigation through a complex history of transmission, gives sailors a way to maintain direction even when the sky is clouded or land is out of sight. Combined with estimates of distance and speed, compass bearings help build a practical geometry of the sea. Scholars still debate exactly how early chartmakers constructed the first Portolans, but compass-based navigation, accumulated sailing experience, and repeated copying almost certainly play central roles. The mystery is sharpened by the quality of some coastlines. The Mediterranean is an ideal laboratory for such mapping because it is enclosed, heavily travelled, and lined with ports linked by trade, war, pilgrimage, fishing, and diplomacy. Generations of sailors cross the same waters, correct the same hazards, and compare knowledge in the same harbours. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Majorca, Barcelona, and other maritime centres form a world of intense practical geography. A pilot who knows the safe approach to one harbour may exchange information with another who knows a dangerous cape farther east. Over time, these fragments can be refined, but the leap from accumulated route knowledge to a coherent chart remains impressive, and no single explanation fully accounts for its early sophistication. The Portolan charts also reveal how knowledge can be precise without being theoretical in the way modern science expects. They do not begin with a perfect model of the Earth, they begin with use. A chartmaker does not need to solve every problem of projection to produce something that helps sailors move between known places. Accuracy is concentrated where sailors need it most along coasts and sea lanes. Inland regions may be blank, decorative, or secondary, mountains, rivers, and cities away from the shore matter less than capes, bays, and islands. This coastal obsession makes the charts feel modern, but their modernity is selective. They are practical before they are global. A lesser-known detail is that many Portolan charts are oriented and labelled in ways that reflect their function as objects to be used from different angles. Place names along coastlines are often written perpendicular to the coast, sometimes facing inland, allowing a reader to rotate the chart and follow the shore visually. Colours may distinguish important ports from lesser ones, with major harbours written in red and others in black. The charts are often made on parchment, sometimes retaining the shape of the animal skin. Some are plain and working-like, while others are lavishly decorated for wealthy patrons, with flags, rulers, cities, animals, and distant lands embellished far beyond practical need. As with the Piri-Reis map, beauty and utility are not enemies. A chart can be both tool and prestige object. The Majorcan school of cartography adds another layer. In the western Mediterranean, especially on the island of Majorca, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim geographic traditions intersect in a commercial and intellectual environment shaped by maritime exchange. Some charts associated with this world combine Portolan precision with broader geographic imagination, extending beyond the Mediterranean into Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, though not a simple navigational Portolan, reveals this hybrid quality coastal knowledge, trade routes, political imagery, legendary information, and learned geography sharing one surface. It reminds us again that maps are not pure categories. Practical sea knowledge and world picture imagination often meet in the same artefact. The accuracy of Portolan charts has led some writers to propose lost ancient surveys or secret mathematical traditions behind them. Such ideas are not necessary, and the more cautious view remains stronger. The Mediterranean was one of the most intensely navigated bodies of water in the pre-modern world. Its sailors did not need modern instruments to accumulate reliable relative positions over time. Dead reckoning, compass bearings, estimated distances, repeated voyages, and correction through use could produce a body of knowledge far better than outsiders might expect. Still, it is fair to say that the earlier surviving examples appear so developed that scholars continue to ask what earlier stages have disappeared. The evidence remains incomplete. The first Portolans we possess may not be the first Portolans that existed. This missing prehistory of Portolan charts is important. If earlier working charts were used heavily at sea, they were unlikely to survive in large numbers. Salt, damp, rough handling, and constant correction would wear them down. What survives may include more carefully preserved copies, presentation versions, or charts kept in archives. Therefore, the apparent suddenness may be partly an illusion created by loss. The charts seem to arrive fully formed because the more fragile ancestors vanished. It is the same pattern seen again and again in the history of maps. Survival makes innovation look abrupt. The Portolan puzzle also exposes the limits of medieval European stereotypes. It is easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a period of cartographic confusion, but sailors cannot afford comfortable ignorance. Trade networks require dependable knowledge. Grain, oil, wine, wool, spices, timber, pilgrims, soldiers, envoys, and prisoners move across the sea. Every voyage adds to a collective memory of currents, winds, ports, and hazards. A merchant ship entering a harbour at night does not care whether a scholar has produced an elegant theory of longitude. It needs a pilot who knows the approach. Practical intelligence thrives wherever mistakes are expensive. At the same time, Portolan charts do not solve every problem. Their strengths remain regional. When chart-making expands into the Atlantic, with its open distances, stronger oceanic uncertainties, and less familiar coasts, distortions become more serious. The Mediterranean's enclosed geography helps sustain accuracy. The wider world resists. This is why the transition from Mediterranean Portolan skill to global cartography is not a smooth triumph. The old methods carry sailors far, but they must eventually confront problems of scale, projection, longitude, and unknown coastlines that cannot be solved by local experience alone. Yet the Portolan charts leave a legacy far beyond their immediate waters. They teach mapmakers to respect the coast as evidence. They show that repeated navigation can create a durable visual geography. They provide models later compilers can borrow, adapt, and combine with new discoveries. Their influence reaches into the age of Atlantic exploration, where older Mediterranean habits meet the vastness of oceans not yet fully understood by Europe. In that meeting, maps become stranger again. Partly precise, partly speculative, partly secret, partly outdated before the ink dries. What makes the Portolan charts so compelling is not that they should be impossible. It is that they show how much can be achieved by disciplined practice before theory catches up. They are the cartographic equivalent of a well-worn sea road, invisible on the water but made real by generations of crossing. Their lines do not descend from magic. They rise from work from pilots watching headlands emerge through mist, from merchants comparing distances in crowded ports, from chartmakers copying and correcting coastlines by hand, from sailors who know that a wrong bearing can turn profit into wreckage. The mystery they preserve is the mystery of cumulative human skill, and that skill soon becomes entangled with a far larger and more dangerous claim that some old maps may have known a southern world of ice, before modern explorers ever saw it. The southern edge of old maps has always been a place where certainty weakens. For centuries, mapmakers drew the known world with growing confidence around Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas. But far below the familiar continents, there remained a vast blankness that seemed to demand an answer. The human mind dislikes empty space on a map. It fills absence with theory, rumour, balance, hope, fear, and ornament, long before any confirmed modern sighting of Antarctica. The lower margins of world maps often carried some version of a great southern land. Sometimes it is enormous, wrapping around the bottom of the globe like a counterweight. Sometimes it is broken into imagined coastlines, capes, gulfs, and names. To modernise, these forms can look like prophecy. In their own time, they often belong to something more complicated, not discovery, but expectation. The idea of a southern continent does not begin with sailors seeing Antarctica. It grows from ancient geographic reasoning. Greek thinkers who imagine the Earth as a sphere also imagine zones of climate, balance, and symmetry. If there is much land in the north, perhaps there must be land in the south to balance it. This is not modern geology. It is philosophical geography, an attempt to make the world orderly before observation can reach every shore. Over time, the imagined terra australis becomes a persistent feature in learned cartography. It moves through texts, diagrams, world maps, and Renaissance atlases. It is adjusted as new voyages reveal more of the oceans, but it does not disappear easily, because inherited ideas rarely vanish the moment evidence becomes inconvenient. This is where many claims about impossible maps begin. A 16th century or earlier map shows a southern land. A modern reader notices that Antarctica also lies in the far south. The two are connected, and the map is declared impossible. But the connection is often much weaker than it appears. A landmass drawn in the south may be speculative. It may reflect classical theory, not observation. It may represent a distorted part of South America, Australia, Java, or lands reported vaguely by sailors. It may be placed there because mapmakers believed a balanced Earth required it. The evidence remains incomplete in specific cases, but no responsible interpretation can treat every southern coastline as proof that Antarctica was known. The Peary Race map is the most famous example, but it is not the only one drawn into the Antarctic debate. Other maps, especially those by Orance Fine in the 16th century and later cartographers, have been claimed by some writers to show Antarctica before official discovery. Fine's 1531 world map depicts a large southern continent, and its shape has sometimes been compared to Antarctica, yet the same caution applies. Renaissance mapmakers often included Terra Australis as a hypothetical land. Their southern continents change shape from map to map because they're not based on a full survey of an ice-covered continent. They are part inherited theory, part speculation, and part response to scattered voyage reports. When the imagined world happens to overlap the real one in broad position, resemblance can be seductive. The strongest version of the fringe claim goes further. It argues that some old maps show Antarctica not merely as a southern land, but as an ice-free continent, implying that the original source must come from a time before Antarctica's ice sheet covered the coast or from a civilization advanced enough to survey beneath ice. This idea has enormous dramatic power. It suggests a forgotten chapter of human history older than agriculture, older than cities, perhaps older than the memory of the last ice age. But mainstream geology and archaeology do not support it. Antarctica has been glaciated for millions of years, though the extent and behaviour of its ice have changed over deep time. There is no accepted evidence for a prehistoric human civilization capable of mapping an ice-free Antarctic coast, and no secure archaeological trace of such a civilization exists. The claim survives because it is vivid, not because the evidence is strong. Still, the persistence of the claim reveals something important about maps and imagination. Antarctica is uniquely suited to mystery. It is remote, hostile, white, and mostly hidden under ice. It was one of the last continents to enter confirmed modern geography. Even today, much of what people know about it comes from instruments, satellites, aircraft, and scientific surveys rather than ordinary human travel. An old map that seems to gesture towards such a place feels like a tear in chronology. It seems to whisper that someone was there before history admits it. But whispers are not the same as records. A resemblance between shapes is not enough. Coastlines are irregular, and the human eye is excellent at finding patterns, especially when a mystery has already been suggested. A more grounded explanation begins with distortion. Early mapmakers face an enormous challenge when they try to place new lands on old frameworks. South America is especially troublesome during the first decades after European contact. Its eastern coast is explored in segments, but its southern extent is uncertain. The continent can be stretched, rotated, duplicated, or continued into unknown space on some maps. Southern South America may bend eastward, or merge visually with imagined southern lands. A viewer looking backward from modern knowledge may separate these forms into Antarctica, but the mapmaker may have been wrestling with reports from the Atlantic and the old expectation of Terra Australis at the same time. Projection adds another layer. Flattening a sphere onto a surface is never simple. Different projections distort shape, area, direction, and distance in different ways. Early modern cartographers do not always have consistent methods, and when they combine sources made with different assumptions, the results can be strange. A coastline copied from one chart may not fit neatly into another map's framework. A landmass can appear displaced or warped, not because it records secret knowledge, but because the map is a compromise between incompatible pieces of information. No single explanation fully accounts for every odd shape, yet distortion, copying, and theory together explain far more than lost Antarctic surveys do. There is also the issue of labels and context. Many supposed impossible maps do not actually name Antarctica or describe a frozen southern continent. They show land in the south because mapmakers expected land there. Sometimes inscriptions make clear that the region is unknown or conjectural. Sometimes later readers ignore the uncertainty embedded in the map itself. The visual form becomes more famous than the cartographer's intention. A speculative coastline is treated as an observed one. A decorative or theoretical feature becomes a clue in a grand secret history. The map is asked to testify to something it may never have claimed. The real discovery of Antarctica, when it enters confirmed modern exploration, is slow, dangerous, and difficult. It is not the simple unveiling of a continent everyone already knew from ancient charts. Southern voyages by Europeans gradually push into colder waters, testing the limits of ships, crews, and supplies. Sailors encounter ice, storms, fog, and vast empty seas. The continent itself remains elusive because pack ice and weather conceal it. When confirmed sightings occur in the 19th century, they belong to a world of stronger ships, expanding scientific curiosity, imperial competition, and increasingly systematic navigation. Even then, mapping Antarctica properly takes generations, and the continent resists easy knowledge. This resistance should make us more respectful of the old mapmakers, not less. They were not fools for imagining southern land, nor were they prophets for placing it there. They were working with the tools and ideas available to them. In some cases, their speculations pointed in the general direction of reality. In other cases, they were wildly wrong. The line between insight and error can be thin when the evidence is scarce. A map can preserve a correct intuition for the wrong reason. It can also preserve a wrong theory in a form that later seems meaningful because the world happens to contain something vaguely similar. Antarctica before its discovery is therefore not a case of simple impossibility. It is a case study in how maps invite overreading. They combine image, authority, age, and silence. When a map is old enough, its mistakes can look profound. When a region is remote enough, speculation can look like suppressed knowledge, but the calmer explanation is more powerful. The southern lands on old maps reveal the struggle between inherited theory and expanding observation. They show how mapmakers tried to complete a world they could not yet fully see. They remind us that blank spaces are never truly blank in the human imagination. And yet, even after the unsupported claims are set aside, a quieter mystery remains. Why were some ancient and medieval navigators able to go so far without the tools modern people consider essential? How did sailors cross open water, return to small islands, follow seasonal winds, and carry routes through memory with such confidence? The answer does not lie beneath Antarctic ice. It lies under the night sky, in the movement of waves, in birds over the horizon, in the accumulated intelligence of people who learned to read the planet long before they could draw it with modern precision. Long before imperial archives begin locking sea charts behind guarded doors, sailors are already pushing beyond the horizon with nothing more mysterious than wood, cloth, memory, courage, and the hard lessons of failure. The modern world often imagines ancient seafaring as timid, as though early mariners hugged the shore in fear and only later learned to cross open water. There is some truth in the importance of coasts. A coastline offers landmarks, shelter, fresh water, and a path home. But the archaeological and historical record also suggests something more restless. People crossed seas far earlier, and more often than the old simplified story allows. They did not need to know the full shape of the earth to travel astonishing distances across it. This matters because some maps seem impossible only when ancient sailors are underestimated. If the past is imagined as closed, provincial, and frightened of open water, then every distant coastline on an old chart feels like a miracle. But the ancient world is full of movement. The Mediterranean is crossed by traders, migrants, pirates, soldiers, pilgrims, and fishermen for thousands of years. The Red Sea and Indian Ocean become highways of seasonal commerce. The Pacific is settled by navigators whose achievements still challenge modern assumptions about what can be done without instruments. The North Atlantic, harsh and cold, is crossed by Norse sailors long before Columbus. None of this proves every mysterious map claim. It simply widens the realm of what is historically plausible. The Phoenicians are among the great early examples. From city-states such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, they build maritime networks across the Mediterranean, founding colonies, trading metals, dyes, timber, glass, and luxury goods, and carrying their alphabetic writing system into wider circulation. Their ships reach the western Mediterranean, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules into Atlantic waters. The exact limits of their voyages remain debated, and later accounts must be treated with care, but their reputation as master sailors is not an invention. They occupy a world where trade depends on knowing winds, currents, harbours, and political risks across huge distances. One famous ancient report claims that Phoenician sailors, sent by an Egyptian pharaoh, circumnavigated Africa by sailing from the Red Sea and returning through the Mediterranean after several years. The story is preserved by Herodotus, who himself expresses doubt about one detail. The sailors reported that the sun was on their right when they sailed westward around the southern part of Africa. To a Greek observer unfamiliar with the southern hemisphere, this sounded unbelievable. To modern readers, it is precisely the detail that makes the account intriguing, because it is what sailors would observe if they rounded Africa's southern waters. Scholars still debate whether the voyage truly happened, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet the story shows how ancient geographic knowledge can appear strange because observers lack the framework to understand it. Greek sailors, too, are part of this expanding maritime world. The Greeks colonize across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, founding settlements from southern Italy to the shores of Anatolia and beyond. They carry myths, trade goods, warfare, and practical route knowledge. Their geographers try to convert this moving world into description and theory. Pythias of Massalia, a Greek explorer of the 4th century BCE, reportedly travels into the far north, perhaps reaching Britain and possibly hearing of or encountering lands near the Arctic. Much of his work survives only through later authors, some of whom distrust him. This creates the familiar problem an explorer may have seen or heard remarkable things, but the surviving record filters his account through skepticism, quotation, and loss. What remains suggests that Greek curiosity extended farther than many later readers expected. In the Indian Ocean, navigation develops around a different rhythm. The monsoon winds create seasonal patterns that can be learned and used. Sailors who understand these winds can cross between Arabia, East Africa, India, and beyond with increasing confidence. The sea is dangerous, but it is not random. Knowledge of when winds reverse is a kind of calendar written across the sky and water. Arab, Indian, Persian, and later other sailors participate in networks that carry spices, textiles, metals, ideas, religions, languages, and people across vast distances. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the Indian Ocean is not an empty barrier between civilizations. It is a connected commercial world. Chinese maritime history adds another vast tradition, though it must be handled carefully because it is often pulled into exaggerated modern claims. Chinese sailors, officials, and map makers developed sophisticated riverine, coastal, and maritime knowledge over many centuries. The Great Ming voyages of Zheng He in the early 15th century reached Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, Arabia, and East Africa with enormous fleets, diplomatic missions, and displays of imperial power. These voyages are extraordinary enough without turning them into unsupported claims of a complete pre-Columbian Chinese mapping of the globe. What is documented already shows impressive navigation, shipbuilding, logistics, and political ambition. The mystery does not need inflation to be remarkable. Then there are the Polynesian navigators, whose achievements may be the most important corrective to modern arrogance about instruments. Across the Pacific, human communities settle island worlds separated by distances that can seem almost impossible without maps in the European sense. They voyage in canoes across open ocean, guided by stars, swells, winds, birds, cloud reflections, sea colour, and inherited navigational systems. Their knowledge is not vague intuition. It is trained, structured, and precise within its own tradition. A navigator can hold in memory the rising and setting points of stars, the behaviour of wave patterns around islands, and the seasonal signs of distant land. What survives in the record suggests that human beings can turn the living environment into a navigational chart without drawing it on parchment. A lesser-known detail in Pacific navigation is the use of swell patterns as a kind of oceanic memory. Islands interrupt waves, creating reflected and refracted patterns that trained navigators can detect. The surface of the sea, which to an untrained eye may look like endless motion, becomes legible. Birds also matter. Certain species travel predictable distances from land. Clouds may form or behave differently above islands. The colour of the water can shift near lagoons or reefs. None of these signs works perfectly in isolation. Together, read by a skilled navigator, they create a practical geography of the invisible. This is one reason European observers often misunderstood such voyages. They looked for instruments and written charts, and when they did not find them, they mistook embodied expertise for mystery. The Norse voyages into the North Atlantic offer another example of real exploration that later seemed almost legendary, until archaeology confirmed part of it. Norse sailors settle Iceland and Greenland, then reach parts of North America around the turn of the second millennium. The site at Lance O Meadows in Newfoundland provides physical evidence of Norse presence in the Americas centuries before Columbus. The sagas preserve memories of Vinland, though they are literary texts shaped by time, storytelling, and later writing. Here again the lesson is subtle. A once disputed tradition can contain real geographic memory, but that does not mean every later artifact claiming to show it is authentic. The voyages are real, some maps associated with them are not. Across these examples, a pattern forms. Ancient and medieval people often travel farther than their surviving maps suggest, while their surviving maps sometimes preserve more than their official narratives explain. But the connection between voyage and map is uneven. A journey may happen without producing a durable chart. A chart may preserve a rumour of a voyage without proof that its maker understood the destination. A coastline may enter cartographic tradition indirectly, through captured pilots, traders, interpreters, or copied notes. The sea is crossed by people whose names never become famous. The map later receives the aura of mystery, while the labour behind it disappears. No single explanation fully accounts for every surprising feature on old maps, but ancient navigation provides a powerful restraint against fantasy. It shows that human beings did not need impossible machines to achieve difficult things. They needed accumulated knowledge, social memory, risk, and repeated contact with the environment. They also needed motive, trade, hunger, migration, war, exile, curiosity, and prestige all push people outward. The horizon is not only a boundary, it is a promise of resources, allies, enemies, and escape. This does not mean that every claim of early contact should be accepted. Many proposed ancient transoceanic voyages rest on weak evidence, coincidental similarities, or wishful interpretation. Responsible history must separate documented travel from speculation, but it must also avoid shrinking the past into something smaller than it was. The real ancient world is already wide, mobile, and connected. It contains sailors who move by stars, merchants who cross monsoon seas, island navigators who rid swells, and northern crews who push through fog toward unknown coasts. The maps that appear too early are best understood against this wider human restlessness. They may not reveal lost satellites or vanished world empires, but they may preserve hints of routes, reports, and contacts that flowed through old maritime networks. They remind us that the sea, far from being an empty barrier, has often been a road, and before ink fixes that road onto parchment, the route exists somewhere more fragile and more powerful in memory, in practice perception, and in the quiet ability of a navigator to look at stars, waves, birds, and wind, and know which way home lies. A map drawn in ink can survive in an archive, but the first map a navigator trusts may never leave the mind. It is built from repetition, fear, habit, and attention. It has no neat border and no decorative title. It shifts with season and weather. It is carried in the memory of a person who knows that the world gives signs, but only to those who have spent years learning how to read them. Before the ocean becomes a measured grid of latitude and longitude, before coastlines are corrected by survey and satellites, the sea is already mapped by stars, currents, winds, swells, birds, clouds, smells, and the deep human need to return. This kind of mapping is easy to underestimate because it leaves so little behind. A parchment chart can be displayed under glass, a carved stone can be photographed, a written itinerary can be translated. But a body of navigational memory often dies unless it is taught. It lives in apprenticeship, in practice, in correction, in journeys repeated under real danger. A young sailor learns not from a diagram alone, but from watching an older pilot make decisions when the sky is half covered, when the wind shifts, when the water changes colour near shoals, when land should be near but remains invisible. The evidence remains incomplete because most such knowledge was never written down in a form historians can easily recover. Yet what survives in maritime tradition suggests that non-modern navigation could be disciplined, precise, and subtle. The stars are the most famous guide, and for good reason. In the Northern Hemisphere, the North Star offers a steady reference point. Though its usefulness varies with latitude and historical period, other stars rise and set in patterns that can be memorized. Constellations become seasonal markers. Their positions announce not only direction, but time of year. A sailor who understands the sky can estimate latitude, maintain course, and recognize when a voyage is drifting from expectation. But star navigation is not as simple as looking upward and choosing a bright point. Clouds interfere, the horizon may be obscured, the sea is moving, the observer stands on an unstable deck. Skill lies in combining what the sky offers with everything else the environment reveals. In the Pacific, navigators use star paths with extraordinary sophistication. A destination island may be associated with the rising or setting position of particular stars. During a voyage, one guiding star eventually rises too high or sets, and another takes its place. The route becomes a sequence of celestial handoffs. In this system, the sky is not a decorative dome above the world, it is a moving compass, but the stars are only part of the pattern. Swells carry information across long distances, winds have seasonal tendencies, birds move between feeding grounds and nesting islands, clouds may gather above land. A trained navigator does not depend on a single sign. He reads a field of signs and weighs them against memory. The sea itself is perhaps the most difficult map for outsiders to understand. To the untrained eye, waves seem chaotic, their surfaces broken by wind and light. But ocean swells can travel far from the storms that create them, maintaining direction across great distances, where swells encounter islands, reefs, or currents. They change, reflect, bend, and overlap. In some traditions, navigators learn to feel and see these patterns. A canoe or vessel moving through crossing swells becomes a kind of instrument. The body senses rhythm, angle, and interruption. This is not mystical intuition, it is trained perception, but because it is so hard to write down, it can look mysterious to cultures that privilege instruments over embodied knowledge. Birds provide another layer. Certain seabirds roam far from land, while others return to land at predictable times. A sailor who knows the habits of particular species can infer direction and distance. Floating vegetation, driftwood, pumice, insects, and changes in watercolour may also signal proximity to land or river outflow. Smell can matter near coasts, especially after rain or when vegetation is dense. Clouds can reveal islands because warm land affects air currents and moisture. In shallow tropical waters, the colour of the sea changes with depth, sand, coral, and reef. Each sign is uncertain by itself. Together, they create probability. Ancient navigation often works not by perfect certainty, but by narrowing danger. Currents and winds are the great invisible roads. The Mediterranean has its seasonal patterns and local winds. The Indian Ocean is shaped by the monsoon system, which reverses direction with the seasons and allows planned crossings between Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. The Atlantic has currents and trade winds that later become essential to European oceanic expansion. But they do not begin to exist when Europeans map them. They are part of the planet's older machinery. Available to anyone who learns through experience how they behave. A sailor who knows when to depart may accomplish what a sailor departing at the wrong season cannot. Timing is geography. This is why oral memory matters so much. A route across open water may be preserved not as a line on a flat map, but as a sequence of remembered conditions which start to follow at a certain season. How long before the swell changes? When birds appear? Where storms gather? What wind should carry the vessel home? In some cultures, this knowledge is encoded in chants, stories, genealogies, teaching diagrams, or ritualized instruction. The outward form may look poetic or ceremonial. But within it may be practical information. Modern categories can mislead here. A chant can be a navigational tool, a story can be a land register, a sacred path can also be a route map. There are also physical aids that do not resemble modern maps. In parts of Micronesia, stick charts are known from later ethnographic records, representing swell patterns, islands, and navigational relationships in abstract form. They were not necessarily used like European charts aboard a vessel. They could be teaching devices, memory aids, or conceptual models. Their importance lies in showing that mapping need not imitate the visual conventions of Europe to be sophisticated. A few curved sticks and shells may encode relationships that matter more to a navigator than an outline of a coastline. The form is different, because the problem is different. On land, similar principles apply. Desert travellers memorise wells, grazing zones, dunes, stars, and routes between safe points. In snow-covered regions, subtle changes in wind, slope, ice, and animal behaviour guide movement. Forest peoples know paths invisible to outsiders, marked by tree forms, sounds, soil, insects, and seasonal growth. In mountain regions, the safe route may exist only at certain times of year. A map that shows a pass as a line may tell less truth than the memory of someone who knows when snowmelt turns the slope lethal. Geography is not merely where things are. It is when they can be crossed. Such knowledge helps explain how geographic information could accumulate before it was formalised. A sailor may never draw a map, but his route knowledge can enter a pilot book. A pilot book can influence a chart. A chart can be copied by a map maker in a city far from the sea. A court geographer may then combine that coastline with classical theory. Centuries later, modern viewers see only the final drawing and ask how the mapmaker knew so much. The answer may lie not in the mapmaker alone, but in generations of anonymous observers whose perceptions were slowly translated into lines. Scholars still debate how much oral and practical knowledge lies behind specific old maps. Because direct evidence is often thin, it is easier to study surviving documents than vanished traditions. Yet the principle is secure maps are not the only containers of geographic knowledge. In many societies, they may not even be the most important ones. The ancient and medieval world contains far more navigation than surviving charts can show. When written maps finally capture a coastline, they may be freezing the surface of a much older living tradition. This has consequences for the mystery of maps that seem too advanced. Some may look impossible because they preserve a final visual trace of non-written expertise. Others may look impossible because later readers mistake speculation for knowledge. The difficulty is separating the two. A coastline that matches reality in a useful way may reflect real travel. A coastline that merely occupies a plausible blank space may reflect theory. A name may preserve contact. A shape may preserve copying error. No single explanation fully accounts for every case, and that is why these maps remain powerful. They force the modern world to admit that knowledge can be real even when its path into the archive is broken. The deeper lesson is not that ancient people secretly possessed modern cartography. It is that modern cartography is only one way of knowing the Earth. Long before the world is measured from above, it is known from within. It is known by walking, rowing, sailing, watching, failing, surviving, and teaching. The stars become bearings, currents become roads, birds become messengers from land, memory becomes a chart more durable than paper, until the chain of teaching breaks. And once geographic knowledge becomes valuable enough to bring wealth and conquest, those living maps begin to harden into guarded documents, hidden in courts and archives, because a line on parchment can become a weapon. Once a map becomes valuable, it stops being merely a record of the world and becomes a guarded possession. A line of coast may look harmless to someone standing in a quiet archive centuries later, but in its own time that line can mean ships, taxes, spices, silver, slaves, timber, safe anchorages, military surprise, and the power to arrive before a rival knows the way. Geography is not innocent. It decides who can move, who can trade, who can invade, who can flee, and who can claim a place by drawing it first. The history of mysterious maps therefore cannot be separated from secrecy, because for much of human history, to know a route is to hold an advantage over those who do not. This is especially clear in the age of maritime expansion, but the instinct is older. Merchants protect routes because routes create profit. Desert caravans do not freely advertise every well. Fishermen may guard knowledge of rich waters. Pilots protect harbour approaches, reefs, currents, and safe passages because their expertise gives them status and work. Empires collect geographic information because administration depends on it. Armies need roads, rivers, mountain passes, supply stations, and the distances between them. Rulers who control maps do not simply understand territory. They organise it, tax it, defend it, and imagine possessing it more completely than before. In the ancient world, map knowledge often belongs to administration and power. Mesopotamian rulers need land records and irrigation knowledge. Egyptian officials need boundaries, quarry routes, mines, forts, and river information. Roman power is inseparable from roads, itineraries, surveys, and the ability to move troops across huge distances. These systems do not always produce maps in the modern sense, but they produce geographic intelligence. A road list may be more useful to an official than a beautifully drawn world map. A cadastral record of fields may matter more to taxation than the shape of a distant coastline. The form changes, but the principle remains. Knowledge of space strengthens control. At sea, secrecy becomes sharper because routes are harder to police and easier to lose. A ship that finds a profitable passage can create a commercial advantage for an entire city or kingdom. In the Mediterranean, maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa compete intensely, not only with fleets and merchants, but with information. Knowing the safest winter harbours, the timing of winds, the location of hostile ports, and the conditions of distant markets can determine profit or disaster. A chart is not just a drawing, it is compressed experience, and experience is expensive. When Portuguese and Spanish expansion pushes into the Atlantic and around Africa, cartography becomes a matter of state security. The Portuguese crown has strong reasons to protect information about African coasts, currents, islands, and routes to the Indian Ocean. The Spanish monarchy likewise guards knowledge of the Caribbean and the Americas. In theory, maps and pilots can be controlled. In practice, secrecy leaks constantly. Captured ships carry charts. Foreign agents buy information. Pilots move between employers, willingly or under pressure. Sailors talk in ports. Map makers copy what they can. A route that begins as a state secret may become part of a broader cartographic tradition within a generation. This leaking of information helps explain why maps like that of Piri Reis are possible. An Ottoman admiral does not need to personally sail with Columbus or Portuguese explorers to obtain Atlantic information. He lives in a world where charts are captured, traded, copied, and reported. The Mediterranean is a basin of rivalry, but also of exchange. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities, merchants, prisoners, translators, and renegades all move knowledge across political borders. Official hostility does not prevent practical circulation. Sometimes it encourages it, because states want what their rivals know. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 between Spain and Portugal, gives a stark example of geography becoming law. A line is drawn through the Atlantic to divide newly claimed lands outside Europe between the two crowns. The idea is extraordinary. An invisible meridian across oceans and continents not yet fully known is treated as a legal boundary for empire. Yet enforcing such a division requires knowledge that neither side fully possesses. Where exactly are the lands? How far do they extend? Which coast lies on which side of the line? The map becomes an argument, not merely a description. To draw a world is to claim a world. This political quality appears again and again. Maps decorate royal courts not only because they are useful, but because they flatter ambition. A ruler looking at a world map sees more than rivers and coasts. He sees possible tribute, enemies, routes, and destiny. The map turns distant places into objects of decision. It reduces terrifying distance into manageable image. This is powerful, but also dangerous. A map can make conquest look orderly long before soldiers experience mud, hunger, disease, resistance, and storm. The clean line on parchment often hides the violence required to make that line matter. A lesser-known detail of map secrecy is the role of the pilot. In many maritime systems, pilots possess practical knowledge that rulers and mapmakers need but cannot fully replace. A chart can show a harbour, but a pilot may know how to enter it in bad weather, which landmarks align with the channel, where hidden rocks lie, which local authorities demand payment, and where fresh water can be taken without conflict. Some states attempt to regulate pilots, license them, test them, or bind them to official service. Their knowledge is personal and strategic. A captured pilot may be more valuable than a captured map because he can explain what the map leaves unsaid. This is one reason maps sometimes contain deliberate ambiguity or omission. Not every chart is designed to teach outsiders. Some may leave out details, distort sensitive routes, or rely on knowledge the intended user already has. A map can be both revealing and withholding. It may display enough to demonstrate power, while concealing enough to protect it. Scholars still debate how often deliberate falsification appears in particular maps, because it is difficult to distinguish intentional secrecy from error, copying, distortion, or lack of information. But the broader logic is clear. In a competitive world, geographic knowledge is not always shared generously. Secrecy also shapes the survival of maps. A public religious map may be copied widely. A scholarly map may circulate among educated readers. A state chart, however, may remain locked in an archive or used within a limited administrative circle. If the archive is destroyed or reorganized, the chart may vanish entirely. If a single copy is stolen or captured, it may reappear in a rival tradition. The surviving record can therefore give a distorted impression of who knew what. Some knowledge may have been widespread among sailors but absent from libraries. Other knowledge may have been carefully preserved in courts but unknown to ordinary travellers. The map that survives may be a leak from a hidden system. The Casa de la Contratación in Seville offers a later example of institutionalised geographic control. Spain attempts to manage overseas navigation, collect reports, train pilots, and maintain official cartographic knowledge through a master map known as the Padrón Real. This official chart is updated with new discoveries and used to regulate navigation to the empire. The idea reflects a profound shift. The world is no longer only discovered through voyages. It is administered through continuously updated geographic information. Similar impulses appear elsewhere. Empires learn that maps must be maintained, not merely drawn once. Yet this desire for control always struggles against the sea's disorder. A storm can drive a ship off course and produce accidental discovery. A mutiny can redirect knowledge. A prisoner can remember a coast. A local guide can reveal a passage. A smuggler can know routes better than an official pilot. Indigenous peoples possess geographic knowledge that European maps first ignore, then absorb without credit. The finished chart may bear the name of a royal cartographer. But behind it may stand countless unnamed informants whose knowledge was extracted through trade, alliance, coercion, or violence. What survives in the record suggests that maps of empire are often built from the knowledge of people empire tries to dominate. This is one of the darker truths behind the beauty of old maps. Their colours, compass roses, ships, banners, and elegant coastlines can make expansion look graceful. But many were made in worlds of conquest, enslavement, forced conversion, extraction, and war. The map transforms lived places into spaces of strategy. It turns islands into stepping stones, rivers into access routes, and coasts into claims. It can erase local names and replace them with names chosen by outsiders. A map may preserve knowledge, but it can also overwrite memory. The line that helps one sailor arrive may mark the beginning of catastrophe for those already living there. No single explanation fully accounts for the strange authority maps acquire, but part of it lies in their ability to make the invisible visible. A route across open water cannot be seen from shore. A political boundary through forest or desert may not exist in the landscape. A claimed empire may be too large for any ruler to experience directly. The map gives these abstractions a body. It allows people to believe they possess what they can draw. That belief has consequences, even when the drawing is wrong. The ancient maps that seem to know too much are therefore also maps of hidden struggle. They preserve not only observation, but competition over observation. Their surprising coastlines may reflect stolen charts. Their gaps may reflect guarded secrets. Their distortions may reflect political theory or deliberate concealment. Their place names may reveal whose language held power at the moment of copying. A map is a record of geography, but also a record of who was allowed to define geography. As the story moves deeper into the older roots of mapmaking, the question of secrecy leads toward a different kind of lost knowledge, the scholarship of the ancient Mediterranean, where mathematics, astronomy, measurement, and library culture tried to give the world a rational shape. Long before oceanic empires guarded Atlantic charts, scholars in Alexandria and elsewhere attempted to measure the Earth itself. Their work would survive in fragments, errors, translations, and revivals, shaping maps for centuries after their own world had changed beyond recognition. Alexandria enters the story not as a lost paradise of perfect knowledge, but as a place where human beings try to make the Earth intelligible with tools almost too fragile for the size of the task. The city rises on the edge of Egypt, between the Mediterranean and the Nile, a meeting point of ships, scholars, soldiers, merchants, officials, translators, and texts. It is a city built by conquest and sustained by grain, trade, royal ambition, and intellectual hunger. In its libraries and scholarly institutions, the world is not merely travelled, it is measured, compared, argued over, copied, and arranged into systems. If ancient maps sometimes seem to know more than they should, part of the explanation lies here, in the long effort to turn scattered experience into mathematical geography. The most famous name is Eratosthenes, working in the 3rd century BCE. He is often remembered for estimating the circumference of the Earth, but the achievement is more than a clever calculation. It shows that the ancient world contains thinkers willing to connect a local observation to planetary scale. Eratosthenes hears that at Syene, near the time of the summer solstice, the sun can shine nearly straight down a deep well, while at Alexandria, a vertical object still casts a shadow. By comparing the angle of that shadow with the distance between the two places, he estimates the size of the Earth. The exact value depends on the length of the stadion he used and the accuracy of the distance, so scholars still debate the precision of his result. Yet the method is the true marvel. A shadow in Egypt becomes evidence for the size of the planet. This kind of thinking changes what a map can be. A map is no longer only a memory of routes or an image of sacred order. It can become a model of a spherical Earth. It can place cities, rivers, and coasts within an imagined grid of measurement. Ancient Greek geography is not isolated from practical travel. It feeds on sailors' reports, military campaigns, trade routes, earlier Egyptian and Mesopotamian knowledge, and stories carried through imperial networks. But at Alexandria and in related scholarly traditions, those pieces are processed through mathematics, astronomy, and criticism. The goal is not merely to list places, it is to understand the structure of the inhabited world. Of course, ambition exceeds evidence. Ancient scholars do not have access to modern survey instruments, global voyages, or reliable longitude. They depend on distances reported by travellers, military records, sailing estimates, caravan routes, and earlier authors. Such reports can be exaggerated, rounded, misunderstood, or copied incorrectly. A road distance does not equal a straight-line distance. A day's sailing changes with wind and current. A merchant may know the sequence of ports, but not their exact position. A soldier may record marching days without accounting for terrain. When these fragments are converted into geographic coordinates, errors become part of the system. This is one reason ancient mathematical geography is both brilliant and dangerous. It gives maps a framework strong enough to organise the world, but also strong enough to preserve mistakes. Once a respected scholar fixes a place into a system, later readers may inherit not just the insight, but the distortion. Knowledge becomes durable, and so does error. A coastline may be placed incorrectly not because no one has seen it, but because the available reports have been forced into an imperfect model. The evidence remains incomplete for many ancient sources, especially because so much has been lost. But the surviving tradition makes one thing clear. Ancient geography was never a simple contest between fact and fantasy. It was an ongoing negotiation between observation, authority, and calculation. Claudius Ptolemy, writing in Roman Egypt in the 2nd century CE, becomes one of the most influential figures in this negotiation. His geography offers a method for mapping the world using coordinates, assigning positions to thousands of places. In principle, this is revolutionary. It gives later mapmakers a way to reconstruct maps from numbers rather than merely copying pictures. A map can be redrawn if the coordinate list survives. It can be projected, organised, and compared. Ptolemy's work becomes one of the great bridges between ancient and later cartography. But the bridge carries cracks. Ptolemy's geography contains major errors. Eurasia stretches too far east. The Indian Ocean is enclosed in some versions by a southern landmass. The Earth's circumference, in the tradition that influenced later readers, can appear smaller than it truly is. These distortions matter enormously. If the distance across Eurasia is exaggerated and the globe is imagined as smaller, then the ocean between Europe and Asia to the west seems narrower than it really is. This mistaken inheritance helps shape the geographic imagination of later centuries, including the assumptions that make Columbus believe Asia can be reached more easily by sailing west. Ancient authority, revived after centuries, does not simply enlighten the Renaissance, it misleads it as well. The survival of Ptolemy's work is itself a story of cultural transmission. Texts move through Greek manuscripts, Byzantine scholarship, Arabic intellectual traditions, and later Latin Europe. They are copied, translated, corrected, misunderstood, and celebrated. The geography is not a fossil preserved untouched in stone. It is a living text, altered by the conditions of survival. Maps associated with Ptolemy and later manuscripts may not be identical to anything he personally drew. Some may be reconstructions from coordinates. Others may include medieval or Renaissance updates. The chain is long, and every link introduces possibility preservation, improvement, corruption, and invention. The Library of Alexandria, often imagined as the single great vault of all ancient knowledge, has become almost mythic in modern culture. Its loss is treated as if one fire erased a complete memory of the ancient world. The reality is more complicated and less cinematic. Alexandria's scholarly collection suffered decline and damage through multiple events. Political changes, neglect, and transformations over time. No single explanation fully accounts for the loss of its intellectual world. But the broader tragedy is real enough. Ancient texts disappeared in enormous numbers, works known by title survive only as references in later authors, maps, diagrams, route descriptions, and geographic treatises vanished almost completely. What remains is a fraction, filtered by copying priorities and historical accident. This loss creates the shadow in which impossible map theories grow. If ancient libraries held many geographic works now gone, perhaps some contained astonishing knowledge. That is possible in a modest sense. There were certainly lost maps, lost treatises, lost voyage accounts, and lost regional descriptions. But possibility must not be inflated into certainty. The disappearance of ancient texts does not prove that the ancient world possessed complete maps of Antarctica, the Americas, or the entire globe. It proves that the surviving record is partial. The unknown should be respected, not filled too quickly with whatever story modern imagination desires. Still, the vanished knowledge of Alexandria and related centres matters deeply. It shows that ancient scholars had methods, curiosity, and ambition that later centuries could inherit even in damaged form. They measured shadows, compared distances, debated the size of the Earth, and tried to locate places within a rational order. Their work gave later mapmakers a vocabulary of latitude, climate zones, coordinates, and projections, even when incorrect. It kept alive the idea that the Earth could be systematically represented. That idea would become essential when new voyages began adding coasts that classical geography had never included. There is a lesser-known irony here. The revival of ancient geography in Renaissance Europe does not simply open the world, it also traps the world inside old expectations. Mapmakers respect Ptolemy so deeply that they must negotiate with him even when new evidence contradicts him. A newly reported coastline may be bent to fit classical assumptions. An unknown southern land may be drawn partly because ancient theory expects it. The old and the new do not replace each other cleanly. They overlap, producing maps that look strange because they are trying to serve two masters' inherited authority and fresh observation. This is one of the central reasons ancient maps can feel out of time. They may contain a classical coordinate, a medieval sailor's coastline, an Arab geographic name, a Portuguese report, a biblical tradition, and a Renaissance decorative convention all in one image. The map is not from one moment, it is an accumulation of moments. Its date tells us when this particular object was made, but not when every idea inside it first entered the stream. A 16th century map may carry a 2nd century error, a 14th century Portolan habit, and a recent report from across the Atlantic. To call it simply ancient, medieval, or early modern can hide the layered nature of its knowledge. Alexandria's legacy is therefore not a secret master map waiting to be rediscovered. It is a way of thinking that survives in fragments the conviction that the Earth can be measured, that the sky can help locate the ground, that reports from travellers can be compared, that distances can be criticised, that the world is large but not unknowable. This legacy travels through manuscripts and mistakes, through scholars who never see the places they describe, through sailors whose practical knowledge challenges inherited theory. It is fragile, brilliant, and incomplete. By the time early modern mapmakers confront the Atlantic world, they are not drawing on blank minds. They inherit centuries of mathematical geography, some of it right, some of it wrong. They inherit lost libraries through surviving fragments, and they inherit vanished maps through copies no longer recognised as descendants. The maps that seem impossible are often born from this collision. They are not pure relics of a forgotten golden age. They are crowded meeting places where ancient calculation, medieval navigation, imperial secrecy, and new discovery press against one another until the parchment can barely contain them. Among the maps said to know too much, few have travelled a stranger modern journey than the Vinland map. It does not carry the same southern ice or global grandeur as the Piri Reis fragment. It is smaller in ambition, colder in atmosphere, and more specific in its claim. It appears to show part of North America, labelled as Vinland in a medieval context, suggesting that knowledge of Norse voyages across the Atlantic survived in map form long before Columbus. For a world trained to treat 1492 as a clean dividing line, such a map seemed capable of disturbing one of history's most familiar stories. It promised a parchment bridge between saga memory and geographic proof. The appeal is easy to understand. The Norse voyages to the western Atlantic are real. Around the turn of the second millennium, Norse sailors from Greenland reach parts of North America. Archaeology at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland confirms a Norse presence there, with remains of turf buildings, ironworking, and other traces of a short-lived settlement or base. The sagas preserve accounts of lands west of Greenland, including Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Though these texts are written down after the events they describe and shaped by memory, literature, and tradition, the record is real, but it is incomplete. A medieval map showing Vinland would therefore be extraordinary, not because it proves the Norse reached America, since archaeology has already done that, but because it would show that this knowledge entered learned cartography in Europe before the age of Columbus. When the Vinland map emerged in the 20th century, it seemed to offer precisely that. Associated with a medieval manuscript context and presented as a 15th century map, it showed the Old World and, across the Western Ocean, an island like Vinland. If authentic, it would suggest that at least some European scholars had access to knowledge of North Atlantic lands before Columbus sailed. The timing of its public attention also mattered. It appeared in an era fascinated by exploration, national memory, and the rewriting of old discovery narratives. It seemed to confirm that the Atlantic had been crossed, remembered, and mapped in medieval Europe, not merely preserved in northern stories. Yet almost from the beginning, doubts gathered around it. The map's provenance was problematic. Its ownership history before the modern period was not secure enough to satisfy everyone. Provenance matters because an object without a clear chain of custody is vulnerable to manipulation, misunderstanding, and forgery. A map can look old because it is drawn on old material. It can be inserted into an old manuscript context. It can imitate medieval style well enough to impress at first glance. The older and more important the claim, the more heavily the evidence must bear scrutiny. The Vinland map offered a dramatic possibility, but drama does not remove the need for caution. Scientific testing became central to the debate. For decades, scholars and scientists argued over the ink, the parchment, the drawing style, the relationship of the map to known medieval texts, and the possibility of modern forgery. One of the most important issues involved the presence of vanitas, a form of titanium dioxide, in the ink. Some argued that its characteristics suggested a modern pigment or contaminant inconsistent with a medieval origin. Others challenged aspects of that interpretation, proposing alternative explanations or questioning the testing methods. The argument became technical, prolonged, and unusually public for a manuscript map. Scholars still debated the details for years, but the broader trend moved steadily toward rejection of authenticity. More recent analyses have strongly supported the conclusion that the Vinland map is a modern forgery. Testing indicated that the ink contains modern materials, and the map appears not to be a genuine medieval witness to Vinland. For those who loved the mystery, this conclusion can feel disappointing, but it should not be. The exposure of a forgery is not the destruction of history. It is the protection of history from false evidence. A forged map can distort the past as much as a lost map can illuminate it. If the goal is to understand what people knew, when they knew it, and how that knowledge travelled, then an attractive false document is more dangerous than a blank space. The Vinland map controversy is especially instructive because it separates two truths that are often confused. The Norse reached North America before Columbus. That is well supported by archaeology and by the broader historical context of Norse Atlantic expansion. The Vinland map, however, does not appear to be a genuine medieval map of that knowledge. One fact does not rescue the other. A real voyage can inspire a fake artifact. A forged map can attach itself to an authentic history and borrow its credibility. This is why careful evidence matters. Without it, truth and invention become entangled until each weakens the other. There is also a human reason for the map's appeal. Discovery stories carry prestige. Nations, cultures, and institutions often care deeply about who arrived first, who knew first, who deserves credit, and whose ancestors belong in the grand narrative of exploration. The Vinland map entered a world where the Columbus-centered story was already being questioned, and rightly so. Indigenous peoples had lived in the Americas for thousands of years before any European arrival. Norse sailors had reached North America centuries before Columbus. The idea that a medieval map proved pre-Columbian European knowledge seemed to fit a broader correction of old myths. Yet a correction built on a forgery cannot stand. The true correction is already powerful enough. America did not begin in European awareness in 1492, and European contact did not begin with Columbus, but that does not make every claimed pre-Columbian map authentic. A lesser-known detail in this debate is how forgeries often exploit real gaps. The best false artifacts do not invent entirely random worlds. They place themselves where historians already know something is missing. There are real Norse voyages. There are real medieval manuscripts. There are real losses in the cartographic record. There are real questions about how widely Vinland stories circulated outside the Norse world. A forgery can slip into that uncertainty and seem plausible, because it answers a question people want answered. It offers a clean object where the true record gives fragments. That is why the evidence must be tested not only for what the object claims, but for how conveniently it satisfies modern desire. The controversy also shows the changing power of scientific analysis. Earlier generations of scholars judged manuscripts through paleography, style, historical comparison, and material inspection. Those methods remain important, but chemistry, imaging, and materials science have transformed the study of old artifacts. Ink can reveal itself. Pigments can betray a date. Parchment may be old while the writing on it is newer, erasures, retouching. And compositional differences can become visible under modern examination. The map that once seemed to speak with medieval authority can be made to answer questions its maker never expected. In this sense, modern science becomes a kind of countermap, charting not coastlines, but layers of material truth. At the same time, scientific results must be interpreted carefully. A contaminated sample, a misunderstood pigment, or an overconfident conclusion can mislead. This is why debates over objects like the Vinland map can last so long. Scholars do not reject major artifacts lightly when the implications are large. They examine, challenge, retest, and argue. To outsiders, this may look like indecision. In reality, it is how knowledge protects itself. The evidence remains incomplete in many historical problems, but in the case of the Vinland map, the balance has moved strongly against authenticity. The map remains important now not as a medieval witness to discovery, but as a modern witness to desire, controversy, and the need for method. The real Norse story is more compelling without the forged certainty. There are sailors in open boats crossing from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland toward lands west of the known Norse world. There are Greenlandic settlements clinging to life in difficult conditions. There is timber needed in a treeless or resource-poor environment, and land beyond the sea where wood, grapes or berries, pasture, and other resources may have been remembered in saga form. There is contact, and likely conflict, with indigenous peoples already living in the regions the Norse briefly explored. The Norse presence does not become a lasting European colonisation at that time. It flickers, leaves traces, and fades. That is not failure as a story. It is a reminder that discovery and possession are not the same thing. The Vinland map would have made the story easier by turning memory into a visible outline, but history is often less generous. It leaves a settlement site, literary traditions, scattered references, and debate. It does not always leave the map one hopes for. This is the same pattern seen throughout the wider mystery of ancient maps. Some objects survive and seem impossible. Some objects vanish and leave only echoes. Some objects appear to fill a gap but turn out to be modern inventions. The task is not to accept or reject mystery in a single gesture. It is to sort the fragments patiently. In that way, the Vinland map controversy becomes a cautionary pause in the larger journey. It warns that age, beauty, and a compelling story are not enough. It shows how a false map can attach itself to a true voyage. It reminds us that the desire for hidden knowledge can make people less careful precisely when care is most needed. And it prepares the ground for another field of disputed cartographic claims, one where real maritime achievement has also been stretched into unsupported legend. The question of China, its maps, its oceanic power, and the modern stories that have tried to turn documented voyages into a secret mapping of the entire world. The story of Chinese maps and ocean voyages begins in a place that is often misunderstood, because the real history is already large enough to attract exaggeration. China's cartographic traditions are ancient, varied, and technically impressive in their own right. They include administrative maps, military maps, river maps, coastal charts, celestial diagrams, route records, and world pictures shaped by diplomacy, trade, and imperial imagination. They do not need to be transformed into proof of a secret global discovery to matter. Their importance lies in showing that mapping did not develop along one European line alone. Many civilizations learned to organise space, measure territory, and imagine the world beyond their frontiers, each according to different needs. Chinese states have strong reasons to map early and often. A large agrarian empire depends on land, taxation, river control, roads, defences, cities, mountains, and borders. Rivers are especially important. The Yellow River and Yangtze are not just watercourses, they are arteries of farming, transport, flood danger, and political authority. To govern such spaces, officials need records of distance, terrain, districts, canals, passes, and strategic points. Maps serve administration and command. They help make a vast realm thinkable from the centre. As elsewhere, this does not mean every map resembles a modern projection. Some are schematic, some emphasise routes, hierarchy, or political order more than a measured shape. But they are tools of power, and power has a long memory for geography. By the medieval period, Chinese geographical writing and mapping include increasingly broad knowledge of surrounding regions. Trade along land and sea routes brings information from Central Asia, Southeast Asia, India, the Islamic world, and beyond. Buddhist pilgrimage records, diplomatic missions, merchant activity, and frontier administration all contribute to a widening picture. Chinese mapmakers are not working in isolation from the rest of Eurasia. Information crosses linguistic and cultural boundaries through envoys, traders, monks, prisoners, and travellers. What survives in the record suggests a world of exchange, but also a world where foreign knowledge is often filtered through Chinese political and cultural frameworks. Maritime knowledge grows especially important along China's long coast and through trade networks reaching Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Chinese sailors and merchants travel widely, and Chinese ceramics, coins, and goods move through ports far from the imperial heartland. By the Song and Yuan periods, maritime commerce is extensive, and navigational knowledge develops alongside shipbuilding, harbour administration, and overseas trade, compass use, stern-post rudders, bulkhead construction. And other maritime technologies become part of a complex seafaring tradition. Yet the relationship between technology and exploration is never simple. Having the ability to travel far does not mean every possible voyage was made, recorded, or mapped in the way later storytellers imagine. The great turning point, and the source of many later claims, is the age of Zheng He. In the early 15th century, during the Ming dynasty, Zheng He leads a series of enormous maritime expeditions across the South China Sea and Indian Ocean. These voyages reach Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, India, the Persian Gulf, Arabia, and East Africa. They involve large fleets, diplomatic exchanges, displays of imperial power, and the movement of envoys, gifts, goods, and information. The scale is extraordinary. These are not small coastal ventures. They are state-sponsored missions projecting Ming authority across a maritime world already rich with trade and political relationships. The documented achievements of these voyages are remarkable enough. Ships sail across monsoon seas, coordinate large crews, manage supplies, interact with distant rulers, and return with tribute missions, exotic animals, and geographic intelligence. The famous giraffe brought to China from East Africa becomes a symbol of the reach of these exchanges, interpreted through Chinese court culture in ways that blend real animal, political spectacle, and auspicious meaning. This detail is often treated as a curiosity, but it reveals something deeper. The voyages are not merely about navigation. They're about the ordering of the world around imperial prestige. The map, the gift, the animal, the envoy, and the written record all become part of a political theatre of distance. Later popular theories have argued that Chinese fleets went much farther than documented evidence supports, reaching the Americas, Australia, Antarctica, or even mapping the whole world before European expansion. These claims usually depend on disputed maps, loose comparisons, speculative readings, or the assumption that because Zheng He's fleets could travel far, they must have travelled everywhere. Mainstream scholarship does not accept such conclusions. The evidence remains incomplete for many aspects of early maritime contact, but no secure historical, archaeological, or cartographic proof shows that Ming fleets circumnavigated the globe or produced accurate maps of the Americas before Europeans did. The unsupported stories are dramatic, but they inflate real history into something less reliable. One reason these theories appeal is that they challenge a European-centred narrative of discovery. That challenge is valuable in itself. The history of world navigation is not a European monopoly, and the Indian Ocean was an interconnected commercial world long before Vasco da Gama rounded Africa. Chinese, Arab, Indian, Malay, Persian, African, and other sailors all contributed to maritime systems that Europeans entered rather than invented. But correcting Eurocentrism does not require replacing one distortion with another. The answer to an exaggerated European story is not an exaggerated Chinese one. It is a fuller world, with many centres of knowledge, many routes of travel, and many forms of mapping. Chinese maps themselves have sometimes been drawn into these debates. Some later maps appear to include world geography that reflects knowledge from European sources, especially after contact with Jesuit missionaries and the circulation of global cartographic models. If a map is copied, recopied, or given an ancient-looking pedigree, it can be misread as proof that China possessed global knowledge earlier than it did. The same problem appears in other traditions and maps claimed date. Copied date, source date, and physical date may not all be the same. A later copy of older material may also include newer additions. A map can become a layered object, and without careful study, layers are easily mistaken for original knowledge. A lesser-known but important example of this complexity is the way world maps in East Asia often combine different cosmologies and information systems. Some place China within a broader world of tributary relationships, others incorporate Buddhist geography, Islamic-influenced geographic knowledge, or later European projections. A coastline or continent may enter Chinese mapping through foreign contact, translation, or printed sources, then be absorbed into a local cartographic style. The resulting map may look unfamiliar to European eyes, but unfamiliarity is not proof of impossible origin. It is evidence of translation across visual cultures. The issue of Australia shows the same caution. Some writers have claimed that Chinese or other Asian sailors must have mapped Australia before Europeans, and it is entirely plausible that fishermen, traders, or sailors from regions north of Australia had contact with its coasts before European charting. Indigenous Australians, of course, had known and mapped their own landscapes through songlines, memory systems, and cultural geography for tens of thousands of years. But the existence of possible contact is different from proof of a surviving Chinese world map showing Australia in a modern sense. Scholars still debate specific episodes of contact and influence, especially in northern Australia, but broad claims require evidence stronger than resemblance or possibility. The strongest way to understand Chinese cartography is not to ask whether it secretly anticipated every European discovery. It is to ask what problems Chinese mapmakers were actually trying to solve. Imperial administration required territory to be organised, military planning required routes and passes, river management required attention to waterways and floodplains, maritime trade required coasts, ports, winds, and distances, court culture required maps that expressed hierarchy, order, and cosmic legitimacy. These purposes could produce sophisticated results without matching modern global cartography. A map made to govern provinces is not a failure because it does not chart the Atlantic. A maritime route chart is not incomplete because it does not show polar continents. Each map belongs to its use. The Junker voyages also reveal a striking historical contrast. At nearly the same time that Portuguese navigators are pushing down the coast of Africa and Spanish ambitions are forming across the Atlantic, Ming China demonstrates immense maritime capability, then turns away from large state-sponsored oceanic expeditions. The reasons are complex court politics, cost, threats from the north, changing priorities, and debates over the value of such missions. No single explanation fully accounts for the shift, but the result is profound. China does not pursue sustained global maritime empire in the way later European powers do. This is not because Chinese sailors lack skill, it is because technology, state policy, economics, ideology, and strategic pressure do not always point in the same direction. The turning away has fed centuries of speculation. What if the fleets had continued? What if their records were more complete? What if maps were destroyed, hidden, or neglected? These are haunting possibilities, but history must distinguish between what might have happened and what the evidence shows. Lost documents may indeed have existed. Some records of the voyages were damaged, suppressed, or not preserved in full, but lost records cannot be made to say whatever a modern theory needs. The silence of an archive is not a blank check. In the broader mystery of ancient maps, China's role is therefore both corrective and cautionary. It corrects any story that treats Europe as the sole engine of geographic intelligence. It reminds us that mapping, navigation, and long-distance travel developed across many civilizations, but it also cautions against turning real achievement into unsupported legend. The ancient maps that seem to know too much must be read with respect for both possibility and limit. China's sailors crossed great seas. Its officials mapped vast territories. Its scholars absorbed and transformed foreign knowledge. Its fleets reached East Africa in a display of maritime power that still feels astonishing. That is enough to matter. The deeper pattern remains familiar. Maps become strange when knowledge moves across cultures, when later copies absorb earlier sources, when political ambition reshapes geography, and when modern readers bring desire to damaged evidence. Chinese cartography is not a hidden key proving a lost global survey. It is another great stream feeding the wider human effort to make space intelligible, and like every stream, it carries clear water and sediment together: observation, translation, pride. Omission, rumour, and the stubborn tendency of maps to become more mysterious each time they are copied by hands that only partly understand what came before. A map can become mysterious not because it preserves impossible knowledge, but because it has been copied too many times by people trying to make sense of inherited lines. Every copy is an act of trust and an act of risk. The copyist looks at an older surface, perhaps faded, damaged, crowded, or written in an unfamiliar hand, and decides where the coast should continue, where a name belongs, where an island begins, and what an uncertain mark might mean. A single mistake can survive for centuries if later mapmakers copy it with confidence. A faint cape can become a full island. A duplicated name can create a second land. A decorative curve can be mistaken for a coastline. The map, once altered, enters the stream of tradition, and the error begins to look old enough to be true. This is one of the most important explanations behind maps that seem to know things they should not. They are not always windows onto lost voyages. Sometimes they are mirrors reflecting the confusion of earlier maps. The problem is especially sharp when cartographers combine multiple sources. One chart may be based on sailors' bearings, another may come from a classical text, another may contain traveller reports from a distant kingdom, another may show a speculative southern land added for theoretical balance. The mapmaker brings them together on one sheet, but they do not naturally agree. Scale differs, orientation differs, names differ, distances are estimated in different units. Some sources are practical, others symbolic. The finished map may appear to show a coherent geography, but beneath the surface it is a compromise among disagreements. Projection errors deepen the confusion. The Earth is round, but the map is flat, and every attempt to flatten the world distorts something. Shape, direction, distance, and area cannot all be preserved perfectly at once. Medieval and early modern mapmakers often work before projection is standardized in a modern sense, or they inherit information from charts that do not share the same mathematical assumptions. A coastline copied from a Portolan chart may be placed into a world map shaped by Ptolemaic geography. A local route map may be stretched into a continental framework. An island group known by sailing directions may be inserted by guesswork into a wider ocean. The distortion that follows can make familiar lands look like unknown ones. This is how ordinary coastlines can become extraordinary in retrospect. A southern extension of South America can be rotated or stretched, until later eyes imagine Antarctica. A chain of Atlantic islands can be duplicated and moved until it seems to indicate hidden transoceanic knowledge. A speculative landmass can resemble a real continent by coincidence, especially when the viewer already expects to find one. Human perception is hungry for pattern. Once someone suggests that a map shows a forbidden coastline, the eye begins to cooperate. It traces the old ink against a modern outline, forgiving mismatches and exaggerating similarities. The resemblance may feel convincing, but resemblance alone is weak evidence. Place names create their own problems. Names travel badly across languages. A harbour name heard by a sailor may be written phonetically by someone who does not know the local language. A scribe may mistake one letter for another. A translator may replace an indigenous name with a familiar classical or biblical one. A later copyist may shift a label because the coastline is crowded. In some maps, the name of a region floats away from its intended place and attaches itself to a different feature. Over time, the name appears to prove that a mapmaker knew a land he may only have misunderstood. What survives in the record suggests that many cartographic puzzles are also linguistic puzzles. Islands are especially vulnerable to this process. The history of mapping is crowded with phantom islands lands reported, copied, searched for, missed, doubted, restored, and eventually erased. Some begin as real sightings mislocated by poor longitude. Some are clouds, icebergs, floating pumice, or mirages mistaken for land. Some are real islands duplicated under different names. Some are invented from rumour or myth. Once placed on a respected map, they gain authority. A later sailor who doesn't find the island may be blamed for bad navigation, rather than the map being blamed for error. The safer choice for a copyist may be to preserve the island. Removing inherited information requires confidence, and confidence can be dangerous at sea. The island of Brazil, High Brazil, Antillia, St. Brendan's Island, and other phantom lands haunt medieval and early modern Atlantic maps. They belong partly to legend, partly to misreporting, partly to the uncertainty of oceanic space. Some are drawn with striking confidence, given shapes, names, and positions. To a modern viewer, they might seem like clues to early knowledge of the Americas or other hidden lands. In most cases, the safer reading is more modest. These islands show how rumour and expectation can become geography, when repeated through cartographic tradition. They also show how the unknown Atlantic was imagined before repeated crossings disciplined the map. Copying can also preserve outdated knowledge long after better information exists. A mapmaker may have access to a newer report, but still respect an older authority. A printer may reuse an old plate because it is costly to replace. A patron may prefer a familiar world picture. A scholar may hesitate to remove a feature described by Ptolemy or another respected source. In this way, maps can move backward and forward at the same time. A newly discovered coastline may appear beside a mythical inland lake. A precise harbour may sit below a monstrous southern continent drawn from theory. The map becomes a layered field where different ages speak at once. This layered quality is one reason old maps are so easy to misread as impossible. People often assume that everything on a map belongs to the date written on it. If a map is made in 1513, then every line is treated as knowledge available in 1513. But the truth is stranger. Some lines may be much older, copied through long tradition. Some may be very recent, added from a fresh voyage. Some may be speculative, drawn not from observation but from belief. Some may be decorative. Some may be errors inherited without understanding. A map's date is the date of its assembly, not the birth date of every idea inside it. There is also the matter of artistic convention. Early maps often use forms that are not intended as literal survey. Mountains may be drawn as little humps, cities may be shown as towers, rivers may take symbolic paths, sea monsters, ships, rulers, flags, and animals may occupy space for visual and political reasons. Blank areas may be filled because an empty map looks unfinished or because patrons expect richness. A coastline may be stylized to fit the parchment. The modern habit of reading every line as measurement can turn convention into mystery. The old map maker may be communicating importance, danger, ownership, or learned imagination, not precise topography. Even scale can mislead. On some maps, important regions are enlarged because they matter to the intended audience. Holy cities, capitals, trade centres, and familiar coastlines may receive more space and detail than distant lands. A route map may compress empty distance between stopping points. A sea chart may focus on coast while ignoring inland proportion. If a modern viewer overlays such a map onto a satellite image, distortions appear dramatic. But the map was never designed for that test. It belongs to a different visual contract between maker and user. No single explanation fully accounts for every strange cartographic feature, but the combined force of copying, translation, projection, artistic convention, and inherited authority explains many things that once looked impossible. This does not drain the maps of wonder. It changes the kind of wonder they offer. Their mystery lies not in supernatural accuracy, but in survival through misunderstanding. They show how human knowledge is transmitted imperfectly, how errors can become traditions, and how traditions can outlive the conditions that created them. There is a quiet humility in this. The old map maker is not always trying to deceive. He may be doing the best he can with damaged sources and uncertain reports. The copyist is not always careless. He may be preserving a feature because generations before him believed it mattered. The sailor is not always wrong when he reports land that later cannot be found. He may have seen cloud, ice, or an island placed badly by the limits of his tools. The modern reader is not foolish for feeling the pull of resemblance. The human mind is built to connect shapes. But history asks for more than recognition. It asks for context. When copies become confusions, maps become records of thought as much as records of terrain. They show what people feared to omit, what they hoped to find, what authorities they trusted, and how they managed uncertainty. They are not clean photographs of the ancient world. They are conversations across damaged time. Some voices speak clearly, others are muffled, others repeat mistakes so old that they have acquired the dignity of tradition. And once these confusions are understood, the central mystery changes shape. The question is no longer why a map seems to show an impossible continent or a forbidden coast. The question becomes why human beings worked so hard to preserve, copy, correct, decorate, hide, and reinterpret geographic knowledge at all. The answer lies in the nature of maps themselves. They are attempts to hold the world still. They turn movement into memory, danger into line, rumour into form, and power into image. What they really reveal is not a lost machine behind history, but the fragile and stubborn survival of observation across centuries of error. When the most extravagant claims are stripped away, the old maps do not become less mysterious. They become more honest. Their power no longer depends on proving that ancient people possessed satellites, hidden global surveys, or a vanished civilization capable of mapping the planet from pole to pole. The evidence does not support such claims. What remains is subtler and more durable the record of human beings watching the world carefully, passing knowledge through fragile channels, losing most of it, and leaving behind a few surviving sheets that seem brighter because the darkness around them is so large. The ancient maps that appear to know too much reveal first of all how incomplete the surviving record is. This is not a small point. It changes the scale of the problem. Modern history often works from what survived. But survival is not fairness. Practical charts decay, archives burn, manuscripts are scraped, reused, neglected, stolen, or eaten by damp. Sailors carry knowledge that dies with them. Local guides know routes no court ever writes down. A ruler's secret map may vanish when a dynasty falls. A merchant's coastal sketch may be lost in a shipwreck. A sacred geography may survive in story, but not in ink. The past was not as empty as the archive makes it seem. It was simply more fragile. This fragility explains why a single surviving map can feel almost impossible. It may preserve the visible end of a long invisible chain. A coastline copied in the 16th century may descend from a 15th century chart, which may preserve a 14th century sailing tradition, which may rest on generations of practical knowledge from pilots whose names were never written anywhere. The modern viewer sees one object and asks how its maker knew. The better question is how many people knew pieces of it before him, and why almost all evidence of their knowing has disappeared. The maps also reveal that knowledge does not move in clean lines. It crosses borders through trade, war, captivity, translation, theft, marriage, pilgrimage, diplomacy, and rumour. It passes between people who may not share a language or a worldview: a Muslim pilot, a Christian merchant, a Jewish cartographer, an African coastal guide, an Indian ocean sailor, a Chinese official, a Norse settler, a Polynesian navigator. A Mediterranean monk copying an old text, none of them needs to understand the whole planet to contribute a line, a name, a route, or a correction. The map becomes a meeting place for partial knowledge. Its mystery comes from the fact that the meeting itself is rarely documented. This is why some of the most surprising maps are composite. They carry the fingerprints of many traditions at once. A Ptolemaic framework may hold a newly reported Atlantic coast. A Portolan coastline may sit beside a speculative southern continent. A sacred centre may share space with practical sea routes. An imperial map may include local knowledge taken from people who had no power over how their world would be drawn. The finished object can seem anachronistic because it contains more than one time period. It is not one mind speaking from one year. It is a layered accumulation, and layers can make the past appear to fold over itself. At the same time, these maps reveal the stubborn life of error. This is just as important as the survival of accuracy. A false island can remain on charts for centuries. A mistaken coastline can be copied because it comes from a respected source. A theoretical southern land can persist because scholars believe the Earth requires balance. A wrong measurement can influence explorers because it fits their hopes. The history of cartography is not a straight ascent from ignorance to truth. It is a long struggle between observation and inheritance. Sometimes new evidence corrects old belief. Sometimes old belief bends new evidence into a familiar shape. Sometimes both remain together on the same page. The surprising detail is that error can be useful evidence. A mistake copied across several maps may reveal a shared source. A distorted coastline may show how information travelled. A phantom island may tell us what sailors feared, expected, or misreported. A misplaced name may expose a chain of translation. Even when a map is wrong, it can be historically valuable. It may not tell us where land truly was, but it can tell us how people imagined, misunderstood, or argued about land. In that sense, the mistakes are not dead ends. They are clues of a different kind. The maps also reveal that discovery is rarely the clean event later stories make it appear to be. A land does not enter history only when a king's expedition names it. People may already live there. Neighbouring peoples may already trade there. Sailors may have seen it and failed to settle it. Fishermen may know waters that scholars ignore. A voyage may occur without a durable record. A report may circulate without becoming official. A map may preserve a hint of knowledge before the famous date. Not because the official discovery is false in every sense, but because official discovery is often a political label placed on a much messier process. What survives in the record suggests that knowledge usually arrives in fragments before it becomes announcement. This has consequences for how the past should be treated. It is easy to replace old simplifications with new fantasies. If the traditional story gives too much credit to named European explorers, the answer is not to invent a hidden super-civilization behind every map. The answer is to widen the field of attention. Anonymous pilots matter. Indigenous guides matter. Traders, interpreters, captives, monks, scribes, mathematicians, and coastal communities matter. Their knowledge may survive only indirectly, embedded in a chart that later bears someone else's name. The true mystery is not that one impossible genius knew everything. It is that so many ordinary people knew enough, and history forgot almost all of them. Scholars still debate many details of the construction of early Portolan charts, the sources behind Piri Reis, the pathways of specific geographic names, the extent of lost archives, and the influence of oral navigation on written cartography. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every puzzle. But the broad pattern is clear. Maps are not isolated artifacts. They are social objects. They are born from movement, need, ambition, fear, and memory. They carry both fact and desire. They are corrected by experience and corrupted by repetition. They reveal the earth, but they also reveal the minds that tried to hold the earth still. So the ancient maps that should not exist do exist, not because history has been hiding a single impossible secret, but because human knowledge has always been more uneven, more mobile, and more fragile than simple timelines suggest. They force a more mature kind of wonder. The question is not whether every strange coastline is proof of a lost age. The question is how much patient observation can vanish before only one strange coastline remains. A map is a survivor. It is a remnant of decisions. Voyages, copying rooms, dangerous seas, and hands that believed a line was worth preserving. In the end, what these maps really reveal is the human refusal to remain lost. People draw because they travel because they hunger, trade, flee, conquer, search, and dream. They make maps because the world is too large for memory alone, yet memory is where every map begins. The surviving parchment is only the last stage of a much older act. Someone looked at land from the sea, or stars from a deck, or a river from a field, and decided that the knowledge must be carried forward. Whether that knowledge arrived perfectly or broken, it crossed time, and on the old maps, in lines faded by centuries, that crossing is still visible. At the end of the long trail, the old map lies quiet again. The arguments around it may be loud, but the object itself remains almost silent parchment. Ink, pigment, names, coastlines, compass lines, and the faint marks of hands long gone. It does not explain itself. It does not say which line came from a sailor's report, which from an older chart, which from a classical authority, which from rumour, and which from imagination. It leaves the modern world to do what mapmakers have always done. Gather fragments, compare them, doubt them, and try to make a coherent shape out of uncertainty. This is why the ancient maps that seem not to belong to their own time continue to matter. They are not only objects of mystery, they are tests of how people think about the past. One kind of imagination looks at them and wants a single hidden answer, a lost continent, a vanished master civilization, a secret archive, a forbidden voyage, an erased technology. That desire is understandable. The world has lost so much that the mind naturally dreams of one great key that would unlock everything at once. But the maps resist that simplicity. The real story is not a locked door with one key. It is a corridor of half-open rooms, each containing some mixture of evidence, error, memory, and silence. The last lines on the vellum carry the weight of this complexity. A coastline may be both wrong and meaningful. A southern land may be imagined and yet reveal the intellectual habits of an age. A portolan chart may not be mathematically modern, yet still preserve generations of navigational brilliance. A forged map may be historically false, and still reveal the modern hunger for older proof. A copied mistake may outlive the person who made it by centuries. A place name may survive after the route that carried it has been forgotten. The maps do not offer clean certainty. They offer survival. Survival is not a passive thing. For a map to reach the present, it must pass through dangers almost as real as those faced by the sailors it describes. It must avoid water, fire, insects, war, theft, neglect, fashion, religious change, political collapse, and the ordinary human decision that an old piece of paper is no longer useful. It must be kept by someone, copied by someone, valued by someone, or simply forgotten in the right drawer long enough to be rediscovered. Many maps fail this test. Most maps fail it. The ones that remain are not necessarily the best, the first, or the most accurate. They are the lucky survivors of time's enormous carelessness. That accident of survival gives them an almost unfair authority. A map under glass looks final. Its age gives it dignity. Its beauty gives it persuasion. Its silence allows projection. But the responsible viewer has to remember the missing crowd around it, the lost charts, the destroyed pilot books, the oral routes, the local guides, the harbour knowledge, the scribal copies, the damaged originals, the maps that were used until they fell apart. The surviving map is not the whole past. It is a shard, yet the mistake is to treat the shard as the entire vessel. And yet a shard can still cut deeply into certainty. These maps unsettle the easy timelines by showing that knowledge does not always wait for famous dates. The Atlantic does not become real in 1492. The Indian Ocean is not born when Europeans enter it. The Pacific is not empty before it appears on European charts. The Mediterranean is not ignorant because its maps are medieval. The Americas are not unknown to those who live there, nor to the Norse who briefly reached their northern edges. Every map is shaped by the perspective of its makers, and every claim of discovery depends on who is allowed to count as a discoverer. This is one of the quiet consequences of the story. Ancient and early maps often reveal as much about power as about geography. They show who names a place, who erases a name, who owns the materials of record, who decides which route becomes official knowledge, and who disappears into the background as a source rather than an author. An empire may draw a coast because local pilots helped its ship survive. A court cartographer may inscribe a land using information gathered from merchants. Prisoners, rivals, or indigenous guides. The finished map may bear the seal of power, while the knowledge inside it comes from people power barely acknowledges. What survives in the record suggests that maps often remember the world, while forgetting many of the people who made that memory possible. The mystery of ancient maps, then, is not only about whether some coastline was known earlier than expected. It is about the fragile ethics of memory. To read these maps carefully is to restore complexity to the past. It means admitting that ancient and medieval people were neither ignorant children nor possessors of impossible technology. They were human beings with sharp eyes, strong motives, limited tools, inherited errors, and extraordinary patience. They watched the earth in ways modern people sometimes forget how to watch. They followed weather, birds, currents, shadows, stars, coastlines, and stories. They guessed, corrected, copied, and sometimes misunderstood. They lived inside a world not yet fully measured, but never entirely unknown. Scholars still debate individual maps, and they will continue to do so because the evidence remains incomplete. Some questions may never be settled. The missing sources behind Piri Reis may never be fully reconstructed. The earliest stages of portolan chart making may remain partly hidden. Lost maps from ancient libraries may never return. Many old coastlines will continue to invite disagreement, and some people will always choose the most dramatic explanation over the most careful one. No single explanation fully accounts for every strange line left by the past. But careful uncertainty is not failure. It is the only honest way to stand before evidence that has crossed so many centuries damaged and incomplete. The last lines on the vellum ask for that honesty. They ask the viewer to resist both dismissal and fantasy. To dismiss them too quickly is to underestimate the real intelligence of older worlds. To inflate them into proof of impossible histories is to erase the slower, harder, more human achievement they actually preserve. The better response is to look longer. Look at the coast that bends strangely. Look at the island that should not be there. Look at the empty sea filled by compass lines. Look at the names crowded along harbours where sailors once needed shelter before nightfall. Look at the decorative ships, the imagined beasts, the faded reds and blacks, the margins where certainty gives way to hope. There, in that mixture, the old maps find their legacy. They remind the modern world that knowledge is never as secure as it feels. It can be lost, it can be miscopied, it can be hidden for profit or power, it can survive in fragments without its explanation, it can be rediscovered and misunderstood. Civilizations do not only leave monuments of stone, they leave systems of attention. A map is one of those systems made visible. It is a record of where people believed danger lay, where wealth might be found, where gods or rulers placed meaning, where ships could pass, where roads ended, and where the unknown began. And even now, after satellites have photographed the planet and digital maps can guide a person through streets he has never seen, the old parchment still has a strange authority. It remembers a time when the world was not instantly available from above. It remembers when every coastline had to be earned by approach, when distance had weight, when error could drown a crew, when a blank space was not a design choice but a confession. The maps that should not exist endure because they preserve that older relationship with the Earth slower, riskier, more intimate and more uncertain. Their faded lines do not show a perfect lost world. They show something more moving humanity trying, again and again, to find its way through a world too large to hold, and leaving behind just enough ink for later ages to wonder what else has vanished. In the end, the old maps return to silence, the parchment rests beneath glass, the ink settles into its faded lines, and the world it once tried to hold has moved far beyond it. The seas have been crossed again and again. The continents have been measured from the air and from orbit. The blank spaces that once invited monsters, southern continents, phantom islands, and hopeful rumours have been filled with coastlines, coordinates, borders, roads, and cities. Yet something in the old maps remains unfinished. They still feel alive because they belong to a time when the Earth was not yet easy to see. Their mystery is not only in what they show, it is in what has vanished around them. The lost source charts, the broken archives, the burned libraries, the sailors who never wrote their names, the pilots who carried coastlines in memory, the guides whose knowledge was taken and renamed, the copyists who preserved a line without knowing its first maker, all of them linger behind the surviving sheet. A map is never alone. It is surrounded by absence. Perhaps that is why these ancient maps continue to draw the eye. They remind the modern world that knowledge is not permanent simply because it is known. It can fade, it can be copied badly, it can be guarded too closely, it can be destroyed by fire, softened by water, or lost because no one understands its value until centuries too late. Civilizations do not vanish only when their cities fall, they also vanish when their ways of seeing the world are no longer taught. And still, something survives. A coastline, a harbour name, a strange island, a southern curve of land where certainty runs out. These small remnants are enough to make the past breathe again. They do not prove every legend. They do not open the door to every hidden theory, but they do prove that human beings have always watched the Earth with hunger and patience, always trying to turn danger into direction and distance into memory. So the final image is not of a perfect secret map, locked away with all the answers. It is of a dim room, a sheet of old vellum, and a line of ink crossing an unknown sea. Somewhere beyond that line are sailors watching stars, scholars measuring shadows, merchants following winds, and forgotten hands copying the world before it disappears. The map does not tell everything. It never could. It simply remains, fragile and stubborn, carrying across time the oldest human wish to know where we are, and how to find the way home.